when the final whistle fades and the last chant dissolves into the night air. The stadium enters a silence that feels almost unnatural. I have always believed that silence is the truest sound in football, because it tells the story behind the spectacle. It's the sound that follows a game before players file into the locker room. Their bodies aching, their minds still racing, their breaths heavy with the weight of another week survived. In that silence, long before camera crews and production teams arrived, the locker room was a sanctuary. It was the one place where the helmets came off, the egos softened, and the truth of the sport lived without an audience. It was the place where men could be human again. But one day, the silence didn't return. It was replaced by a presence that didn't belong, an unblinking lens that turned a sacred room into a stage. The first time I felt that shift, it wasn't loud. It was subtle, almost polite. Yet its impact was immediate. When a camera entered the locker room for the first time, players didn't protest, not outright. Instead, they exchanged looks that said what no one dared to say aloud. Something private had just become public. Something honest had just become content. That moment marked the beginning of what I now call the final season. Not a specific year on the calendar, but the metaphorical season when the game stopped being just a sport and became a storyline shaped by outside eyes. It was the season when reality television didn't just observe football, it altered it. When the presence of cameras didn't merely document who players were, but slowly reshaped who they became. I think often about the players who lived through that transition, the ones who entered the building one way and walked out someone else entirely. They didn't lose themselves in a single moment. They lost themselves in fragments, small accumulating shifts in behavior, emotion, and identity. One veteran lineman once told me, "The moment the cameras came in, I felt like I had to choose between being a player and being a character." He said it plainly, without bitterness, but with a quiet exhaustion that only years in the league can create. Before reality television came knocking, the locker room felt immune to performance. It was raw and unfiltered, a space where frustration spilled without judgment, where fear was admitted without shame, where tears were more common than fans would ever imagine. It was where a rookie learned how to swallow panic, where a veteran confronted the reality of decline, where a journeyman understood the truth of being replaceable. There were no plot lines there, just human moments, messy, private, and unedited. But the day privacy met profit, everything changed. Suddenly, authenticity became a commodity. Emotion became footage. Vulnerability became a selling point. The invisible wall that once separated the inner life of the team from the outer world didn't just crack, it collapsed entirely. And in its place stood a new expectation. Every day might now be part of a show. Some players embraced it quickly. They saw opportunity, visibility, personality-driven attention. A chance to stand out in a league where careers are short and roles are fragile. Others retreated inward, shrinking beneath the pressure of being observed in moments that were never meant for public consumption. The divide grew quietly, but unmistakably. Some performed, others endured. I watched players change the moment the red recording light flickered on. Conversations softened. Jokes were filtered. Outbursts were swallowed. Some players, usually the ones fighting for a roster spot, spoke louder, laughed harder, and exaggerated their personalities as though auditions were taking place. They weren't wrong. In some ways, they were. A compelling storyline could shape public perception, and public perception could shape opportunity. But that came with a cost. I remember a season when a young defensive back began every day with a forced swagger, trying to create a persona producers clearly loved. His teammates knew it was an act. He knew it was an act. But he didn't know how to stop performing once he had started. Months later, after being cut, he told a reporter, "I don't know who I was playing for anymore, the coaches, the cameras, or myself." Those words have stayed with me, because they speak to a deeper truth. Once a player becomes a character in someone else's narrative, he risks losing the one voice that matters most, his own. Even the veteran stars felt the shift. A wide receiver who had spent over a decade in the league told me that he missed the days when he could walk into the locker room and simply exist. Now, he said, every moment feels like it has an audience, even the ones that shouldn't. He didn't say it with anger, but with a kind of sorrow, as though something sacred had been quietly taken from him. And then there were the seasons when the presence of cameras didn't teach as influence behavior changed relationships. A conflict that once would have been addressed, resolved, and forgotten became an episode arc. A heated moment that should have stayed between teammates became a storyline for millions. One linebacker described it perfectly. It's like the cameras didn't just record conflict, they created it. Tension grew where it didn't need to. Suspicion deepened where trust used to live. A crack in the foundation became a storyline, and the storyline became a wedge that players could never completely remove. What happens when real pain becomes content? When private arguments become entertainment? When grief, frustration, disappointment, and fear become episodes in a weekly series? These questions lingered in my mind long after the cameras left because the damage didn't disappear when the crews packed up. It remained inside players who couldn't shake the feeling that their most vulnerable moments had been used as plot points, consumed by people who would never feel the weight of those emotions themselves. What happens when athletes become characters in a show they never agreed to star in? The locker room, once the safest place in the building, became something else entirely: part workplace, part performance space, part battleground for unspoken expectations. Some players learned to endure it. Some learned to manipulate it. Some were undone by it. All were affected. There is a moral uncertainty that lingers over this collision between reality television and the locker room. Whose story is it? Who owns the moments that unfold in private? Who decides what is shown and what is hidden? And who, ultimately, pays the emotional price when reality becomes entertainment? These questions define more than a single era in football history. They define the transformation of a culture, a league, and the men inside it. And as we move deeper into this story, we will not look away from the consequences, intended or otherwise. This is where the silence ended. This is where the spectacle began. And this is where the truth lives. When I look back at the evolution of football in America, I sometimes wonder whether the sport changed on its own, or whether we changed it. There was a time when the NFL existed purely between the lines of the field, wrapped in grass, sweat, strategy, and tradition. It was a game before it was a product, a competition before it became a spectacle. But as the decades passed, and as American culture shifted toward mass media, the league found itself standing at the crossroads of sport and entertainment with an opportunity too powerful to ignore. That opportunity would transform the NFL from a competitive league into a cultural empire, one that would eventually collide with the most intimate, unfiltered space in football: the locker room. To understand how this collision happened, we have to trace the league's transformation from Sunday afternoon pastime to billion-dollar media machine. In the early days, NFL broadcasts were simple, almost bare. Cameras followed the ball, commentators filled silences with light analysis, and the audience accepted that what happened off the field was none of their business. But by the 1980s and 1990s, television networks realized something profound about football. It was just a sport. It was a narrative waiting to be packaged. Rivalries, personalities, dynasties, heartbreaks, miracles, controversies. Football contained every dramatic ingredient the entertainment world valued. The NFL recognized this as well. And once it did, the league leaned into storytelling with intention. Rule changes favored offense to increase excitement. Broadcasts became cinematic. Pre-game shows expanded. Halftime analysis grew more theatrical. The league was no longer selling games. It was selling drama, identity, and myth-making. With each passing year, Football became less of a mystery and more of an accessible storyline the public could follow, like a serialized saga. But even as the NFL became a media giant, one part of the sport remained almost entirely untouched: the locker room. For decades, this space remained sacred. It was the emotional core of football, the place where players confronted their fears, argued like brothers, shared unfiltered truth, and wrestled with the physical and mental toll of the sport. It was a private world, out of bounds to anyone without a jersey or official role. Journalists were allowed inside only after games, and even then, the unwritten rules were clear. Speak respectfully. Don't sensationalize. Don't exploit vulnerability. Then reality television arrived. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, reality TV exploded into mainstream culture. Shows like Survivor, Big Brother, and The Real World proved that audiences were hungry for unscripted drama, personality-driven storytelling, and perceived authenticity. Networks realized that people weren't just interested in finished products, they wanted process, conflict, and the messy, behind-the-scenes truth. It was a cultural shift unlike anything before it. Authenticity became entertainment. Lives became episodes. And unscripted drama became the most profitable format in television. Football executives and network producers saw an opportunity. What if they could bring the same unscripted energy to the NFL? What if fans could watch not just the games, but the inner lives of the men who played them? What if the locker room, the most private place in the sport, became the stage for a new kind of storytelling? This question gave birth to Hard Knocks, a show that would change football coverage forever. When the first season aired, it was unlike anything fans had ever seen. Cameras captured cuts, emotional breakdowns, heated meetings, raw conversations, and vulnerable moments that had previously lived in the shadows. Viewers were invited into the engine room of an NFL team, witnessing the stress, risk, and humanity that defined each season. For many fans, it was exhilarating. For networks, it was a goldmine. And for the league, it was the start of a new Year One, where the demand for access began to outweigh the importance of privacy. But inside teams, the reaction was far more complicated. Players felt the shift immediately. Some embraced the cameras with a natural ease, believing visibility could elevate their career. Others recoiled, uncomfortable with the idea that their emotional rawness could become entertainment. Coaches were equally divided. Some saw strategic value in controlling their narrative. Others felt deeply uneasy. One coach once said, "A camera changes people, even if they pretend it doesn't." He wasn't speaking about vanity. He was speaking about human behavior. The moment someone knows they're being watched, a part of their authenticity retreats. Team executives experienced their own conflict. On one hand, these docuseries built brand loyalty and fan engagement on an unprecedented scale. On the other hand, they risked exposing fractures, tension, and decision-making processes that were never intended for the public eye. The locker room had always been a sanctuary. Now, it was a set. As the culture shifted, the public's appetite for true access grew relentless. Fans wanted vulnerability, conflict, honesty, and emotion. They wanted to see who players were without their helmets, how they interacted, how they fought, and how they broke. Networks understood that audiences would reward authenticity even if the authenticity came with ethical complications. And so, the cameras stayed. They multiplied. They evolved into all or nothing and team-controlled docuseries that blurred the line between journalism and marketing. Players began to feel the difference. The locker room wasn't the same. Quiet conversation could become a moment of intrigue. A disagreement could become an episode. A personal struggle could become a headline. Some players reported feeling watched even when the cameras were off, a psychological shift that ran deeper than performance anxiety. It represented a new kind of pressure, one that could influence behavior, relationships, and mental health. A rookie once admitted privately, "I felt like I had to choose between being myself and being what I thought they wanted me to be." His words exposed a truth that many were afraid to voice. Reality TV didn't just document the locker room, it changed it. Coaches also struggled. Some meetings became less direct. Feedback softened. Emotional outbursts were restrained. The presence of cameras forced leaders to consider not just what they said, but how their words would be interpreted by millions. A coach who once felt comfortable confronting a veteran suddenly felt aware that a clipped moment could misrepresent his intent. And executives began to evaluate another unpredictable variable. How will the public react? Early resistance was real and intense. Some head coaches outright refused participation. Others reluctantly agreed but demanded strict control. Several teams believed cameras would disrupt their culture, undermine trust, and create divisions. And they weren't wrong. Over time, as more teams participated, patterns emerged. Conflict intensified when cameras were present. Suspicion grew. Teams that already had tension found those issues magnified under public scrutiny. Some even blamed documentary crews for impacting team chemistry. Eventually, a broader truth became clear, one that frames this entire documentary. Reality TV didn't simply enter the locker room. It altered the psychology of the people inside it. Players began to self-edit. Coaches began to perform. Staff members became aware that their mistakes could be immortalized. The presence of cameras reshaped how people spoke, behaved, reacted, and related to each other. This wasn't just documentation, it was transformation. And so we arrive at the central thesis that guides everything ahead. When reality television merged with football, it didn't just change the stories told about the sport, it changed the sport itself. It altered its culture, rewired its emotional core, and redefined the men who lived inside its walls. This documentary will break that transformation apart in 20 deep, interconnected batches. Each will explore a specific dimension of the shift: how identity, conflict, pressure, mental health, relationships, economics, and authenticity were permanently reshaped by the arrival of cameras in the most intimate place in football. The story ahead is not sensational. It is not exaggerated. It is the truth behind the truth, a layered examination of what happens when the private world of athletes becomes public entertainment. And with that, we begin our journey. I still remember the first time a camera entered an NFL locker room in a way that felt different. It was not after a game when reporters were allowed in under long-standing rules. It was not part of a small local news feature or a brief human interest piece. This camera entered during a moment that once belonged exclusively to the players. It entered quietly, but its presence was unmistakable. It was the moment when the locker room shifted from a private sanctuary into something else entirely. Something that felt less like a team space and more like a media set. For decades, the locker room had been protected by an unspoken code. It was the final barrier between the public and the truth of football. It was where frustration could be released without judgment, where fear could be admitted without shame, and where the emotional toll of the sport could be confronted honestly. Players trusted that what happened in that room stayed there. They relied on that sanctuary to be human in ways the outside world would never fully understand. The first camera challenged that trust. It arrived with a polite explanation that the league wanted to bring fans closer to the personalities of the players. The pitch was simple. People wanted authenticity. They wanted connection. They wanted to see what made players tick. According to the executives, the locker room was the heart of the team, and opening it would deepen the bond between fans and players. That was the message. What the players heard instead was something far different. They heard a threat to privacy and a signal that their innermost world was no longer off limits. When that camera appeared, some players froze. Others tried to pretend it was not there. A few attempted humor to mask discomfort. But privately, the objections were immediate. One veteran linebacker pulled me aside and said that the locker room was the last place he had to protect his sanity. He told me that if the camera stayed, a part of him would have to disappear. He was not alone. Several players voiced frustration behind the scenes, but had already adjusted to game cameras, press conferences, and interview setups. But the locker room was the one space where they did not feel like performers. The arrival of a camera threatened that sense of safety. Coaches noticed the shift too. Before the camera arrived, conversations in the locker room were loose, candid, and emotionally honest. Players spoke without filter because they believed they were speaking among brothers. After the camera appeared, even briefly, the tone changed. Players lowered their voices. Some walked away mid-sentence. Others waited for the camera to leave before expressing anything real. The energy in the room tightened. It was the first evidence that performance and authenticity could not coexist comfortably in a space that depended on trust. The coaching staff had mixed feelings about the new access. Some believed the presence of cameras could humanize the team and create goodwill. Others saw it as an intrusion with unpredictable consequences. One assistant coach confided that he worried players would feel forced to behave differently, and that this would disrupt the culture they had spent years building. He worried that a camera would amplify tension, expose moments not meant for public consumption, and create a false sense of urgency or conflict that had no place in the team environment. He also feared that players who already struggled with pressure would feel even more eyes on them. Those fears proved to be well-founded. Within days of the camera's arrival, small but noticeable changes began to appear. A normally outspoken receiver became quieter during team discussions. A rookie who had finally gained confidence retreated into himself, no longer speaking freely. A defensive lineman who was known for his raw honesty suddenly monitored his emotions, worried that vulnerability might be captured and misinterpreted. These were subtle shifts, almost invisible to the casual observer, but to those who knew the players intimately, the contrast was unmistakable. The locker room had already begun to transform. Authenticity had always been the lifeblood of that space. It was where players could admit weakness without fear of being judged. It was where rivalry softened, where apologies were made, where anger could be released constructively. The presence of a camera compromised that honesty. Even the players who claimed it did not bother them acted differently when it was in the room. Some tried to appear composed. Others tried to appear strong. A few overcompensated with exaggerated humor or louder reactions. It became clear that the camera was not simply documenting reality, it was shaping it. The early objections grew louder as players noticed how even small moments could be misinterpreted by those who did not understand the context of the locker room. A brief argument between teammates might appear volatile. An emotional reaction after a tough practice might seem like a meltdown. A quiet moment might be mistaken for discouragement. The players knew that without context, their private emotions could become public narratives. This fear changed the way they behaved. It encouraged self-monitoring. It discouraged vulnerability. It introduced hesitation where there once had been honesty. One veteran safety expressed what many felt but were hesitant to articulate. He said the camera felt like an unwanted referee in a place where players needed freedom. He explained that football requires emotional release because the sport demands so much. The locker room had always been the only place where players could process the strain without an audience. The camera made that process feel performative, even artificial. He believed that once authenticity is compromised, trust begins to erode. And he feared that erosion would have long-term consequences for team cohesion. The coaching staff attempted to restore confidence by assuring players that the camera would respect boundaries. They promised that sensitive moments would not be exploited. But once the wall of privacy had been breached, even temporarily, the sense of intrusion was difficult to reverse. Players began asking themselves whether the camera was truly off when it appeared to be off. Some wondered what might be captured indirectly. The mere possibility of surveillance shifted the emotional landscape of the room. The tension between authenticity and performance became obvious when players realized that certain behaviors received more attention. Those who were animated or dramatic found themselves approached more often for interviews. Those who were quieter or more private felt marginalized. Some players began leaning into behaviors that attracted interest. Others attempted to conceal their reactions entirely. The contrast created unspoken divisions. It was the first time the locker room experienced a hierarchy shaped not by leadership or ability, but by camera appeal. This shift affected relationships in ways few anticipated. Teammates who once interacted freely began questioning each other's motives. Was someone being genuine, or were they performing for the camera? It's a comment meant for the room, or meant for the audience. These doubts created a subtle layer of suspicion that had never existed before. Football teams rely on trust that runs deeper than ordinary workplaces. Without that trust, communication becomes strained. And once communication fractures, culture follows. The turning point came when a conflict between two players became exaggerated due to the camera's presence. What might have been resolved in minutes turned into a lingering tension. Both players later admitted that they held back from confronting the issue because they did not want to be recorded. The conflict festered. Misunderstandings grew. Other teammates sensed the divide. The situation revealed something fundamental about the intrusion. The camera removed the ability to address problems openly, which is essential for a healthy locker room. Instead of creating transparency, it created barriers. As the team navigated this sudden change, the front office saw how the presence of a camera carried unintended consequences. Executives wanted increased engagement, but they had not anticipated the psychological burden placed on players. They recognized that visibility came at a cost. They also understood that once access had been granted, it would be difficult to retract without appearing secretive. By the time the first camera left, the locker room had already transformed. A new awareness lingered in the air. The players had learned that their sanctuary could be entered without warning. The coaches had learned that their authority could be influenced by outside eyes. The executives had learned that reality and performance could blend in unpredictable ways. And the league realized that the locker room, once off limits, was now the most powerful unscripted space in American sports. The line had been crossed, and nothing about the locker room would ever be the same again. There came a moment in the evolution of reality-driven football coverage when I realized that players were no longer being seen as individuals. They were being interpreted as characters. This shift did not arrive with the force of a sudden storm. It crept in slowly, almost quietly, until it became clear that the presence of cameras had created something entirely new inside the sport. Careers were no longer shaped solely by performance on the field. They were being influenced by the narratives that producers constructed behind the scenes. A player who was shy could be labeled aloof. A player who was outspoken could be framed as volatile. A player who was under pressure could be portrayed as fragile. The editing room became a powerful force, one capable of reshaping reputations in ways that could follow players long after the cameras were gone. The first time I witnessed this transformation, it felt unsettling. A young quarterback had entered training camp with the hope of earning a backup role. He was bright, respectful, and eager to learn. In the locker room, he blended naturally with teammates. He asked questions, he studied film diligently, and he approached each practice with a seriousness that reflected both ambition and humility. But when the episodes aired, he was presented as something entirely different. He became the carefree rookie with a joking temperament, the new arrival who seemed overwhelmed by the pressure. Scenes were cut and rearranged to portray him as inconsistent and uncertain. In reality, he was neither. But once the public adopted that impression, his reputation took on a life of its own. When the coaches evaluated him later in the season, they knew the portrayal was unfair. Yet they also knew that public perception matters more than most people want to admit. Teams are influenced by their fans and the media orbit surrounding them. When a player becomes a character instead of a professional, it is difficult for executives to ignore the noise. In the weeks that followed, the young quarterback noticed the shift. Teammates teased him gently about the portrayal, but he could sense the underlying sting. Coaches saw the jokes and wondered whether he lacked focus. He began to question his own identity inside the team. He once described the experience to me as feeling like he was living in a version of himself, created for entertainment rather than truth. He was not alone in that experience. Several players found themselves boxed into roles that did not reflect their real personalities. A linebacker who was known for his thoughtful leadership was edited into the angry enforcer. A tight end who was respected for his intelligence and discipline became the overly serious veteran who could not relax. A rookie wide receiver who was methodical and introverted found himself labeled as someone lacking passion. These portrayals did not emerge from malice. They emerged from storytelling priorities. Every show required comedic relief, emotional tension, a leadership arc, a conflict moment, and a redemption chapter. Real people were fitted into these structures because narrative clarity often outweighed nuance. Some players embraced their new roles. They enjoyed the attention. They leaned into the persona that the camera preferred. In a league where jobs are unpredictable and careers are short, any spotlight can feel like an opportunity. A few players found themselves elevated because their personalities translated well into episodes. They gained endorsements, media invitations, and fan support, not because of performance, but because they became compelling figures on screen. These athletes discovered that fame could arrive not from touchdowns or tackles, but from charisma and storyline appeal. This created a new category of rising star. One who is not necessarily the best player, but the most visible. Teams noticed this. Some executives believed that increased exposure could benefit the organization. A player who drew attention could attract fans and generate interest. It did not take long for teams to see the potential value of nurturing on-screen personalities. That was the beginning of a subtle but significant shift in how players were evaluated. Popularity began to influence perceived importance. One example stays with me vividly. A defensive back who had always been considered a fringe player found himself suddenly thrust into the spotlight. Because he had a quick wit and a dramatic reaction to being coached hard during a practice, the clip became memorable. It circulated widely. Producers highlighted his humor and intensity, turning him into one of the surprise stars of the series. Fans embraced him immediately. They followed his journey closely. They rooted for him. They expected him to make the roster. Inside the building, the coaches understood that his performance was inconsistent. They knew he was still developing and that he might not be ready for a major role. But cutting him would have created backlash. Keeping him became easier than confronting the storm that would accompany a different decision. In the end, he made the team. He later acknowledged privately that he believed the cameras had saved his career. He felt grateful but conflicted. He wondered whether he had earned his place or simply been carried by a narrative too popular to disrupt. On the opposite end of the spectrum were the veterans who felt their identities shrinking as the cameras shaped the stories around them. Players who had spent years building respect became background figures or were portrayed through narrow lenses. A thoughtful veteran leader could appear inflexible. A quiet professional could be edited into someone detached. A seasoned mentor could be reduced to a symbolic presence instead of a living, complex individual. Several veterans confided that they felt invisible despite their central roles in the team's success. This reduction created a kind of emotional displacement. When you have spent a decade earning your voice, the sudden erasure of that voice can feel like losing a part of yourself. One veteran center told me that he watched an entire season of episodes without recognizing the man he saw on screen. He said that the show made him feel as if he had become a supporting character in his own career. Moments he valued deeply were left out. Moments he considered trivial were highlighted. The distortion left him uneasy. He began questioning whether the public even knew who he truly was. The editing room had power far beyond what most people understood. A small clip could inflate or diminish a player's identity. A sequence of moments could become a personality. A conflict could define someone for years. Producers were not intentionally rewriting lives. but they were shaping interpretations. Those interpretations influenced fans, media narratives, contract discussions, and even team dynamics. Once a storyline took hold, it rarely faded. It followed the player like a shadow. It was during this period that I realized the strongest force inside these shows was not the camera itself, but the narrative it created. Football players are used to being observed. They are not used to being authored. That distinction matters more than most people outside the sport understand. Performance can be measured. Character can be misrepresented. Once misrepresented, it becomes difficult to correct. The players caught in these portrayals had to navigate a dual identity. They were athletes in the building and characters outside it. The friction between those identities created emotional strain. A player who was portrayed as unreliable had to work twice as hard to earn trust. A player portrayed as hot-tempered had to temper himself even when justified. A player who had become a fan favorite because of humor felt pressure to be funny even when he was exhausted or stressed. A player portrayed as a fringe long shot began to feel trapped in that label even if he was outperforming others. The greatest shift occurred when players began adjusting their behavior not for the team, but for the storyline they feared or hoped would be constructed around them. Some players performed personality. Others suppressed parts of themselves. A few withdrew from the cameras entirely. Authenticity became selective. Vulnerability became calculated. Relationships became more guarded. The locker room was no longer only a competitive environment. It became a character-driven ecosystem, influenced by the unpredictable force of editing. When storylines began writing careers, the sport itself bent under the weight of perception. Coaches saw it. Executives sensed it. Players lived it. Football was still football on the field, but off the field, it became something else. It became a place where reputations could be shaped by hands that had never taken a snap or worn a helmet. It became a place where careers were influenced not only by skill, but by narrative. It was the beginning of a new era, and the implications would deepen in the seasons ahead. There is a moment in every NFL preseason when the optimism of summer begins to collide with the reality of roster decisions. It happens quietly. It happens without ceremony. Happens in the meeting rooms where coaches study film late into the night, trying to decide which dreams will survive and which will end before the season even begins. Before Hard Knocks existed, those moments remained hidden behind closed doors. Coaches spoke freely. Players processed disappointment privately. The public only learned about cuts through brief reports. There was no storyline attached, no emotional packaging, no audience ready to react. Then Hard Knocks arrived, and the preseason was transformed. Hard Knocks did something no one had attempted before. It opened the golden doorway into the world of training camp by giving viewers access to the most vulnerable part of the football calendar. For the first time, fans saw rookies fighting for their careers, veterans trying to hold off younger talent, and coaches making decisions that carried consequences far beyond a single season. What had once been a private struggle suddenly became national television. Players knew from the moment the cameras arrived that this show carried a different sort of weight. It felt bigger than anything the league had attempted. It was cinematic in tone, intimate in focus, and relentless in its effort to reveal truth. But that truth came with a price. The players who participated in those early seasons often described the experience as a strange combination of pride and discomfort. They were proud to represent the team, proud to show the public the work that went into preparing for a season. But they also understood that footage could freeze their weakest moments in time. A veteran defensive tackle once told me that training camp had always been the most psychologically demanding part of the year. He said the days were long, the pressure was constant, and the margin for error was razor thin. When Hard Knocks showed up, he felt as if the pressure doubled. He explained that training camp was already a place where players felt exposed emotionally and physically. But when the cameras arrived, that exposure became literal. He recalled a moment when he returned to his dorm room after a difficult practice and found himself unable to relax because he knew the day would eventually be broadcast to millions. He told me that he felt as if his private effort belonged to the public. Hard Knocks changed expectations of preseason by presenting it not just as preparation, but as entertainment. Teams that participated discovered quickly that the audience responded most intensely to moments of struggle, conflict, and vulnerability. Before the show existed, fans never saw the anguish of a player being released or the pride of a rookie learning he had made the team. Those emotions lived within locker rooms and team facilities. But the show turned those internal moments into episodes that viewers awaited every week. The emotional cost of being filmed during cuts cannot be overstated. For players fighting for a roster spot, the day of cuts was already the most difficult day of the year. It represented finality. It represented loss. It represented the collapse of a dream often built since childhood. Before the cameras arrived, a player could absorb the shock privately, call his family, gather his belongings, and leave quietly. Once Hard Knocks began filming, that moment became a story. It became a scene. It became content. One player described it to me as a moment of emotional conflict. He said he did not want his most painful day documented, but he also did not want to seem uncooperative or difficult. He felt trapped between the desire for privacy and the pressure to participate. He told me that when he was released, the cameras followed him as he packed his belongings. He remembered trying to appear calm, even though inside he felt devastated. Later, when the episode aired, the scene became one of the most talked about moments of the season. Fans praised his composure. Commentators applauded his professionalism. But he told me that he did not feel composed or professional. He felt exposed. Another player shared a different perspective. He said that Hard Knocks provided him with a powerful record of his final moments in the league. He appreciated that his struggle was seen, that his effort was recognized, and that his pain was validated. But even he admitted that the experience changed the way he approached training camp. He was aware that the camera could appear at any moment. He found himself rehearsing explanations for mistakes or decisions, anticipating how they might appear on screen. He said the presence of the camera made him feel responsible for telling his own story, even when he was emotionally overwhelmed. Players were not the only ones affected. Coaches also faced the emotional strain of performing their duties under the watchful eye of the camera. One coach explained that the hardest part of the experience was delivering painful news while being filmed. He believed deeply in treating players with respect during releases. He valued honesty, kindness, and clarity. He felt that being filmed compromised those values because it introduced an audience into a moment that should have been private. He told me that he struggled to speak authentically, while knowing the world would judge his tone, his expressions, and his decisions. Another coach pointed out that the presence of cameras changed the energy in meeting rooms. The film sessions, corrections, and confrontations no longer felt purely instructional. He sensed that players acted more cautiously, and sometimes he altered his language to avoid being misunderstood by an audience that did not understand the context of coaching. He emphasized that Hard Knocks did not misrepresent the coaching process, but it did add a layer of self-awareness that altered the natural flow of communication. What made Hard Knocks so influential was its ability to humanize players in a way traditional broadcasts never had. Fans saw players as sons, husbands, fathers, and dreamers. They saw the grueling nature of the sport and the immense pressure placed on athletes who lived on the edge of the roster. They saw the reality of football as a career built on uncertainty. The show created emotional bonds between viewers and players, but those bonds came with consequences. Once fans connected deeply with certain individuals, they developed expectations that teams could not always meet. A general manager once told me that the hardest part of participating in Hard Knocks was managing the emotional reaction of the fanbase. He explained that fans would fall in love with a player featured prominently, often regardless of his performance. He said the team received thousands of messages from supporters demanding that a particular player make the roster. But decisions in the NFL cannot be made sentimentally. The pressure from fans created a tension between what was best for the team and what was best for the storyline. He said that the show amplified public opinion in ways the organization could not ignore. Hard Knocks also reshaped the preseason hierarchy of attention. Before the show, the players who attracted attention were the ones expected to start or make significant contributions. After the show, fringe players often became the most talked about figures. Fans rooted passionately for long shots because the show made their journeys relatable and emotionally charged. The preseason no longer belonged solely to competition. It became a narrative space with rising stars, surprising favorites, and emotional arcs that television audiences eagerly followed. Yet, beneath the positive aspects, a deeper shift was taking place. The emotional cost of being filmed began influencing the mental landscape of the locker room. Players questioned how much of their vulnerability they wanted the world to see. Some tried to control their image, speaking carefully and behaving more cautiously. Others avoided cameras entirely. The honesty of the locker room began to fracture because players were no longer just teammates. They were subjects in a story shaped by others. The power of Hard Knocks was undeniable. It opened a golden doorway into a world that fans had never seen. It humanized a sport often perceived as impersonal and brutal. It revealed the emotional truth behind roster decisions, but it also changed expectations, created new pressures, and redefined the relationship between players, teams, and the public. When I look back on those early seasons, I see both beauty and burden. I see moments of profound honesty, but also moments of unintended pain. Hard Knocks expanded access, but it also expanded exposure. It allowed viewers to understand the sport, but it also forced players to carry the weight of being characters in a narrative larger than themselves. It created unforgettable television, but it reshaped preseason forever. And as the cameras continued rolling, the consequences deepened. There is a particular weight that settles onto a coach when a camera enters the room. It is not the weight of performance, and it is not the weight of expectation. It is the weight of knowing that every decision, every correction, every moment of leadership that once lived inside the private walls of the team is now part of an unfolding story created for public consumption. Coaches have long carried the responsibility of building culture, shaping discipline, and guiding players through the brutal demands of the sport. But when reality-based programming began to infiltrate the locker room and meeting spaces, that responsibility collided with a new and complicated reality. Leadership was no longer something exercised only in front of the team. It became something witnessed by millions who would interpret the smallest nuance without understanding the context behind it. This change gave birth to the coach's dilemma. A head coach once explained to me that leadership in football requires a delicate balance between firmness and compassion. He believed in direct communication. He believed in confronting mistakes immediately. He believed in addressing conflict before it grew into something harmful. For years, he led with clarity and conviction. Players respected him because he spoke honestly and without fear. But when the cameras began documenting training camp, he felt his natural leadership begin to shift. He told me that every time he corrected a player, he became aware of how his tone might be perceived by the outside world. He worried that a firm message would be interpreted as hostility. He worried that a calm explanation would be viewed as weakness. He worried that emotion would be taken out of context and replayed endlessly. He said that coaching with cameras in the room felt like speaking two languages at once. One language was for his team. The other was for the unseen audience. Before the arrival of documentary crews, discipline within a team was handled internally. A player who was late to meetings, a player who broke team rules, or a player who struggled with effort received feedback directly, privately, and respectfully. These were moments of growth and accountability that did not require an audience. But once the cameras were present, the dynamic changed. The smallest disciplinary moment could become a headline. A conversation intended to restore trust could appear confrontational. A lecture meant to motivate could appear harsh or theatrical. Even the most ordinary coaching interaction could be misread by people who did not understand the culture of the sport. Players noticed the shift immediately. They could sense that coaches hesitated. They could sense that conversations were being softened. They could sense that messages were being calculated rather than delivered instinctively. One veteran tight end told me that the hardest part of participating in a televised training camp was watching his coach struggle to preserve the honesty that had defined their relationship for years. He said the coach's directness had always motivated him, but under the eye of the camera, that directness faded. Instead of blunt feedback, he received softened versions of the truth. Instead of immediate correction, he received measured explanations. The player told me he missed the raw honesty because it had always been rooted in trust. Coaches found themselves caught between two expectations. The team needed unfiltered guidance. The audience expected compelling narratives. The conflict created a strain that coaches had never experienced before. One offensive coordinator described it as feeling like he was being asked to lead and perform at the same time. He said that the presence of cameras shaped not only what coaches said, but when they said it. Instead of addressing an issue in the heat of the moment, some coaches waited until cameras were no longer present, hoping to avoid public misinterpretation. This delay sometimes allowed tension to grow. It interrupted the natural rhythm of communication. It changed the timing of leadership. Another coach explained that strategy meetings became more complicated. Football strategy is built on honesty. A defensive coach must be able to criticize a player's technique without worrying about the reaction of fans or commentators. An offensive coach must correct mistakes with precision, even if the correction requires firm language. But with cameras present, some coaches spoke more cautiously. They removed certain details. They softened criticisms. They delivered messages in ways that felt performative instead of natural. This shift impacted players. They could feel the conversations becoming curated. They could sense the hesitation. And hesitation in leadership creates uncertainty. There were moments when private discipline became public drama. A player who received criticism for missing an assignment could find himself suddenly thrust into a narrative about accountability. A conversation intended to teach could be perceived by viewers as punishment. A coach raising his voice in frustration could become the center of a storyline about tension within the locker room. These interpretations often had little to do with the truth, but they influenced public perception, which then influenced the emotional environment inside the team. I remember one season when a young running back missed a critical protection assignment during practice. The coach addressed the mistake immediately. He spoke firmly because the mistake placed the quarterback at risk. The player understood the message. He accepted responsibility and moved forward. Within the team, the exchange was ordinary. It was the natural rhythm of coaching. But when the scene aired, it became exaggerated. Commentators questioned whether the coach was too harsh. Fans speculated that the player was falling out of favor. Neither interpretation was accurate. But once public narratives took shape, the player felt pressure from outside the building that had nothing to do with football. He later admitted that he began second-guessing himself. Not because of the coach's message, but because of the public reaction to it. There were also instances when coaches refused to alter their leadership style. Some believed that authenticity mattered more than public perception. They continued, leading with the same intensity they had always shown. But even they could not escape the ripple effects. Players sometimes felt embarrassed when their mistakes were shown. Others felt judged by people who had never experienced the demands of the sport. Coaches saw morale shift in ways they could not predict. A teaching moment that once carried no emotional residue now carried the weight of national attention. Over time, the presence of cameras began influencing strategy in unexpected ways. Coaches became more cautious about discussing injuries. They became more selective about revealing game plan details. They held back information during meetings, saving certain discussions for private conversations. The cameras did not intentionally compromise strategy, but the possibility of sensitive information reaching the public created an atmosphere of vigilance. Coaches felt as if they needed to protect the team from accidental exposure. Some coaches even adjusted practice routines subtly, not wanting certain drills to be misinterpreted by audiences who lacked context. A drill designed to emphasize physicality could be portrayed as excessive. A correction delivered in frustration could appear unprofessional. Coaches felt as if the lines between leadership and entertainment had begun to blur. The greatest consequence of the coach's dilemma was the erosion of instinct. Effective coaching relies on intuition. It relies on emotional awareness, immediate responses, and an understanding of players that develops over years. When coaches began filtering their instincts through the presence of cameras, their leadership lost its immediacy. It lost its purity, lost its full impact. The players who sensed this shift often described it as feeling like a layer of fog had settled over the locker room. The message still reached them, but it reached them with less clarity. The trust was still present, but it felt slightly altered. The bond between coach and player remained strong, but it was no longer untouched by outside eyes. As reality-based programming continued to evolve, coaches found themselves adapting to a new era. Some embraced the cameras, believing transparency could strengthen the relationship between the team and its fans. Others maintained quiet resistance, hoping to preserve the sanctity of the locker room. But none could ignore the fact that leadership in football had changed. It had become layered in ways that neither the players nor the coaches had fully anticipated. The coach's dilemma revealed something fundamental about the intrusion of cameras into team culture. It showed that leadership cannot remain unchanged when watched by an unseen audience. It showed that discipline becomes complicated when transformed into entertainment. It showed that authenticity becomes fragile when filtered through public interpretation. And it showed that the weight of modern football extends far beyond the field. There is a distinct difference between the pressure that naturally exists within football and the pressure that is manufactured for the sake of entertainment. Natural pressure is woven into the fabric of the sport. It arrives with the weight of expectations, the urgency of performance, and the constant awareness that a single mistake can alter the trajectory of a career. Every player understands this when he steps onto the field. But manufactured pressure feels different. It is imposed from the outside. It is shaped by narrative, amplified by storytelling, and intensified by the presence of cameras that hunger for tension. When reality-based programming entered the locker room, it created a new environment in which players were expected not only to compete, but to compete while being watched by an audience eager for drama. Producers never explicitly asked players to perform. They did not give scripts or direct scenes. But the structure of reality television depends on storytelling, and storytelling depends on conflict. To create compelling content, producers naturally gravitated toward tension-filled moments. They highlighted disagreements. They emphasized uncertainty. They amplified the emotions that appeared to signal instability or struggle. What was once a normal part of the football process became a central element of the show. The cameras created a sense of heightened stakes, even when the stakes themselves had not changed. The players felt this immediately. One young defensive back described it to me as feeling like he was being graded twice. The first grade came from the coaching staff, who evaluated his performance on the field. The second grade came from the unseen audience, who evaluated how he appeared on camera. He told me that he began to ask himself questions he had never considered before. How am I coming across? Do I look confident? Do I seem nervous? Am I saying the right things? His focus shifted from football to perception. He said he hated that feeling, but he could not make it disappear. Younger players were the most vulnerable to this shift. Veterans had already built identities in the league. They knew who they were. They walked into the locker room with established reputations and a clear understanding of what it took to survive the sport. Younger players were still forming their identities. still learning the rhythms of the league, still developing the emotional tools needed to endure the constant pressure of competition. When cameras were added to that environment, the younger players felt as if they were on an extended audition, not just for a roster spot, but for the approval of an audience they would never meet. One rookie offensive lineman told me that he felt as if every moment of training camp became part of a test he did not fully understand. He said that football practice had always been a place where he could focus exclusively on his craft. But once the cameras arrived, he found himself acutely aware of how he looked during drills. He worried about appearing too tired. He worried about being shown in a moment of weakness. He worried that a single mistake might be highlighted in a way that exaggerated its significance. He said that the pressure created by the cameras was not the pressure of football. It was the pressure of performance. This psychological shift had a profound impact on the way younger players carried themselves. Some began to overcompensate. They spoke louder. They exaggerated emotions. They created an energy that did not reflect their true personalities. Others retreated. They spoke less. They avoided eye contact. They attempted to blend into the background to avoid being featured. Both reactions stemmed from the same root. They were adjusting not to football, but to the presence of the camera. The producers played a significant role in shaping the tone of the environment, even without intending to. Reality television thrives on emotional arcs. It thrives on unexpected moments. It thrives on the sense that something meaningful is always happening. To create this feeling, producers focused their attention on players who appeared conflicted, anxious, or uncertain. They captured the small expressions of doubt. They highlighted moments of intense conversation. They paid close attention to situations that might escalate. The players who spent time in these moments felt the weight of being watched in a way they had never experienced before. Some producers openly used phrases that encouraged tension. They asked players how they felt about their chances of making the team. They asked about fears. They asked about rivalries. They asked about difficult coaching moments. They were not manipulating players, but they were guiding conversations toward areas of emotional vulnerability. This guidance created an environment where players felt as if they were expected to reveal tension, even if they preferred not to. For younger players who were still trying to find their footing, these moments felt intrusive and heavy. One rookie wide receiver described it as walking through a hallway filled with mirrors. He said that every time he turned a corner, he could see a reflection of himself that he did not fully trust. The reflection showed a player who was nervous, uneasy, and constantly monitored. He told me he felt as if he had to watch himself from the outside. He said that the experience made him self-conscious in a way that football had never made him feel before. He was no longer just trying to master routes. He was trying to manage emotions that were shaped by the presence of the camera. The psychological shift from football to performance affected the entire dynamic of the team. The locker room, once a place of release, became a place of restraint. Conversations were filtered. Emotions were measured. Jokes were paused. Players who once expressed frustration freely began holding it in to avoid being portrayed as negative or volatile. Others who were dealing with stress or disappointment avoided opening up because they feared their vulnerability would become a storyline rather than a private moment among teammates. The locker room operates at its best when players feel comfortable being completely themselves. When that comfort erodes, trust erodes with it. And trust is the foundation of every successful team. The cameras did not intentionally damage that trust, but their presence altered it nonetheless. The younger players who relied on the locker room for support felt the change most acutely. They needed a place where they could ask questions without fear of judgment, where they could confess insecurities, where they could learn from mistakes. Instead, they found themselves navigating a space that required emotional caution. This level of self-monitoring seeped into practice as well. Players told me that they sometimes felt as if they needed to produce moments of intensity or passion because they sensed the cameras were waiting for something memorable. This created a subtle but significant shift in how effort was displayed. Genuine effort became mixed with performative effort. True emotion became blurred with the desire to appear engaged. Coaches noticed the difference. They recognized the moments when a player was forcing energy instead of channeling it naturally. That forced energy often led to mistakes. It created inconsistency. It made players feel fatigued in ways that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Manufactured pressure also influenced competition between teammates. Players understood that the more attention they received, the more likely they were to become focal points of the show. This created an unspoken tension, particularly among younger players. Some felt compelled to stand out. Others felt threatened by the sudden attention being directed at their peers. The competition was no longer limited to performance on the field. It extended to visibility, narrative appeal, and audience response. The psychological effect was cumulative. It built slowly over the course of training camp until players found themselves questioning whether they were making decisions for the sake of football or for the sake of avoiding certain portrayals. Some began to feel as if the season had started not with the first game, but with the first day of filming. The emotional fatigue that usually appeared late in the season arrived early. It came from the constant awareness that their actions might become episodes. It came from the feeling of being judged not only by coaches, but by viewers who lacked the full context of their struggle. This manufactured pressure revealed something profound about the intersection of sports and entertainment. Football is a sport built on authenticity. Success is earned through honesty, discipline, trust, and effort. When those qualities are filtered through the lens of performance, the emotional landscape shifts. Players feel different. Coaches lead differently. The team environment evolves in ways that cannot be easily predicted. The arrival of cameras created tension not because players could not handle pressure, but because the pressure was no longer purely their own. It belonged to the audience. It belonged to the narrative. It belonged to the producers who shaped the story. And once that pressure entered the locker room, it changed the psychology of every person inside it. The story of manufactured pressure is not just a story about discomfort. It is a story about identity. It is a story about what happens when athletes who have spent their entire lives focused on performance in a competitive sense are suddenly expected to perform in a different way. It is a story about young men learning to navigate a world where the lines between authenticity and portrayal become blurred. And it leads directly into the next transformation that reshaped the NFL's internal landscape. There came a point when NFL organizations realized that the growing appetite for behind-the-scenes access could not be contained by outside production companies alone. Hard Knocks and other documentary projects had opened a doorway that fans were eager to walk through. And the league quickly understood that this demand was not temporary. It was becoming part of the culture of modern sports. Teams faced a choice. They could continue allowing external storytellers to shape their public image, or they could take control of that narrative themselves. Many chose the latter. The rise of team-controlled content began quietly, but it soon grew into one of the most significant shifts in the relationship between football organizations and the public. At first, the move seemed logical. If fans wanted access, teams believed they should be the ones providing it. They had the resources, the relationships, and the trust of players and coaches. They understood the nuances of their own culture. They had direct knowledge of what should be shared and what should remain private. By building in-house media departments and hiring full-time content creators, teams believed they could offer a more authentic and accurate representation of the organization. But beneath the surface, the decision carried deeper implications. It created a new form of power, one that allowed organizations to shape truth rather than simply reveal it. The earliest versions of team-controlled content were modest. Short interviews with players, small features on training camp, behind-the-scenes clips from the weight room or meetings. Fans enjoyed it. Teams saw the engagement numbers rise. And executives recognized that the demand for access was far greater than they had anticipated. Within a few years, these small media departments grew into full production teams equipped with high-quality cameras, editing suites, graphic designers, and full-time storytellers. Some teams invested in documentary-style series that followed the entire season. Others created weekly episodic features that mirrored traditional reality programming. The landscape evolved quickly. The line between sports media and sports marketing became increasingly thin. The motivation behind these decisions was not purely promotional. Teams genuinely believed that they could tell their own stories with more fairness and accuracy than outside production companies. They could highlight moments that showed the strength of their culture. They could protect players from misrepresentation. They could control the tone, the context, and the messaging. But the desire to protect soon blended with the desire to influence. The ability to control content naturally became the ability to control perception. A general manager once explained to me that team-controlled content provided reassurance. He said that external companies sometimes shaped narratives that frustrated coaches and created tension within the team. He believed that internal content could highlight the values and identity of the organization without risking misinterpretation. He emphasized that the objective was not to hide truth, but to frame it responsibly. He said that teams wanted to show fans the reality of football without exposing players to unnecessary scrutiny. But even he acknowledged that control can become tempting. He admitted that the power to influence perception created a subtle pressure to showcase the team in the best possible light. This pressure created a new form of power dynamics within the building. Media departments became gatekeepers of the team's public identity. They decided which stories to tell. They decided which players to feature. They decided which moments would define the culture in the eyes of fans. Players noticed this change. They understood that the more a team highlighted them, the more their reputation grew. Visibility translated into opportunity. Opportunities could influence contract negotiations, endorsements, and public support. The relationship between players and media staff evolved from casual interactions to strategic partnerships. One player told me that he felt compelled to maintain a positive relationship with the team's content creators because he understood how much influence they carried. He said that being featured in team videos built his popularity in ways that could translate into leverage. He admitted that he took extra time after practice to engage with the media staff, hoping to remain visible. He was honest about his motivations. He said that in a league where careers are short, any extra edge matters. His experience illustrated how the presence of cameras, even those controlled by the team, subtly influenced behavior. Coaches also experienced the shift. Many appreciated the ability to highlight the culture they worked hard to establish. They could show fans the details that made their system function. They could demonstrate the daily discipline that defined their team. But privately, some coaches worried that the boundary between authentic leadership and curated leadership was becoming blurred. The more content that was released, the more pressure coaches felt to present a united, polished front. One coach confided that he sometimes held back from expressing frustration during meetings because he did not want those moments captured. He trusted the media department, but he worried about clips being used in ways that might create confusion. He said that even though he respected the purpose of team-controlled content, he felt that the presence of cameras created a small but noticeable filter over his leadership. He acknowledged that it was not as restrictive as external documentary crews, but it was not entirely free of influence either. The deeper complexity emerged from the idea of narrative control. When teams controlled the cameras, they controlled which truths were highlighted and which truths remained hidden. They decided which conflicts were worth addressing publicly and which should be kept private. They chose which players were celebrated, which players were downplayed, and which stories were emphasized. This selective truth-telling raised important ethical questions. Was the content meant to reveal reality, or was it meant to shape a particular version of reality? Players felt this tension as well. A veteran safety once told me that the content produced by the team often captured emotional moments, but rarely captured the struggle behind them. He said that the videos highlighted effort, but softened the reality of pain. They showed unity, but rarely showed disagreement. They celebrated resilience, but avoided the deeper emotional strain that defined many parts of the season. He appreciated the positivity of the content, but he questioned whether it reflected the full truth. He wondered whether fans understood how much remained unseen. As team-controlled content expanded, it also began influencing the public's expectations. Fans grew accustomed to polished storytelling. They expected access. They expected depth. They expected emotional arcs. What began as an attempt to provide transparency slowly evolved into a responsibility to entertain. Teams felt pressure to release content regularly. They created weekly series, daily features, and season-long narratives. Players who were once hesitant to appear on camera found themselves participating out of obligation. Coaches who preferred privacy learned to adapt. Executives measured the success of content by engagement metrics rather than accuracy. The psychological effect of this expansion was subtle but significant. Players began to view the cameras not as external observers, but as extensions of the team's identity. Some embraced this. They enjoyed being part of the storytelling. They saw it as a way to connect with fans. They appreciated that team-controlled content portrayed them with respect. But others sensed that the content still shaped them in ways that felt restrictive. They felt as if they were expected to uphold the image the team wanted to present. They felt as if the cameras were part of the organization's authority structure rather than a neutral presence. One quarterback described the experience as living inside a promotional narrative. He said that team content highlighted success even during difficult stretches, which sometimes created pressure to maintain an emotional steadiness he did not always feel. He said the team's messaging was built on optimism and unity. When he struggled or felt overwhelmed, he sometimes hesitated to show it because he worried that it contradicted the tone of the content being released. He said that the experience taught him to compartmentalize more than ever. It also made him question whether authenticity was becoming a secondary priority. The rise of team-controlled content deepened the relationship between sports and storytelling. It allowed organizations to present themselves with precision. It protected players from external misrepresentation. It strengthened fan engagement, but it also introduced new complexities. It created an environment where perception became tightly managed. It shifted the balance of power toward the organization. It raised questions about the accuracy of the narratives being presented. It blurred the line between honest documentation and curated image. Most importantly, it reshaped the internal culture of teams. Players understood that their behavior, their relationships, and their emotional expressions were no longer captured solely for external entertainment. They were also part of the organization's identity. Coaches understood that their leadership would be filtered through the lens of team messaging. Executives understood that controlling the narrative carried both benefits and responsibilities. The locker room became a place influenced by internal storytelling as much as by internal leadership. This evolution marked the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between players, teams, and the cameras that followed them. It set the stage for deeper emotional conflicts and new forms of competition, not just on the field, but within the walls of the team facility. And it created the conditions for the next transformation in the world behind the scenes. There was a time when the only hierarchy that mattered in an NFL locker room was the one shaped by performance, leadership, and the respect earned through years of sacrifice. Veterans commanded attention because they had endured the grind. Starters held authority because they had proven themselves in the moments that define seasons. Rookies found their place by listening, learning, and demonstrating humility. This natural order had existed for decades because it reflected the values of the sport. But when cameras became a regular presence inside the team environment, the hierarchy began to shift in ways no one had expected. Suddenly, attention became a form of power. Visibility became a form of currency. And teammates who once competed only on the field found themselves competing for something far more unusual: They competed for airtime. At first, this change felt subtle. Players noticed who the cameras gravitated toward, who the producers favored, and who consistently appeared in team-controlled content. It was easy to dismiss these observations as harmless. But as the influence of storytelling grew, so did the consequences. The players who received the most attention often discovered that they had gained an additional layer of visibility that extended beyond the football field. Fans recognized them. Commentators discussed them. Teams subtly reevaluated their value. And players who remained unseen began to feel the weight of obscurity in ways they had never experienced before. One veteran linebacker once told me that he could feel the tension building the moment he realized a young teammate had become a favorite of the production staff. He said that the cameras followed the younger player with an enthusiasm that felt disproportionate to his role on the team. The linebacker was experienced enough to understand the distinction between talent and popularity. But even he felt a quiet discomfort as the younger player's visibility grew. He said that he did not resent the attention itself, but he resented the way it shifted the dynamics in the locker room. Players who had once relied on performance to define worth now worried about how they appeared on camera. Jealousy became an undercurrent that no one wanted to acknowledge. It was not explosive or dramatic. It was quiet and internal. The players who received limited attention began to question their place in the story being told about the team. They wondered whether their lack of visibility reflected their perceived value. They wondered whether the cameras believed they were uninteresting or unimportant. These questions created an uncomfortable emotional environment that subtly divided teammates. The younger players felt this divide most intensely. For them, the experience of being in the league was already overwhelming. They had grown up in an era defined by online presence and public perception. They understood instinctively that attention had value. When the cameras followed one rookie more closely than another, the difference felt like a commentary on personality as much as potential. One rookie wide receiver told me that he felt a quiet ache when he saw teammates consistently featured while he received almost no attention from the production team. He said that he knew logically that the cameras did not determine his future, but emotionally, he could not escape the feeling that he was being overlooked. These dynamics created resentment that players struggled to articulate. Resentment is difficult to express in a locker room because it contradicts the culture of unity that teams rely on. Players are expected to support one another, especially during training camp. They are expected to cheer for each other, to encourage each other, and to celebrate together. But when the cameras introduced a new form of validation, unity became complicated. Players began comparing not just performance, but attention. They became aware of who received interview requests, who appeared in highlight segments, and who became recurring characters in the narrative of the season. In some cases, the tension grew into open conflict. A defensive lineman once confronted a teammate after noticing that the younger player had agreed to a series of interviews without consulting the rest of the defensive unit. He believed that the interviews made the younger player appear separate from the group. He worried that the focus on individual personality would damage their collective identity. The younger player, overwhelmed by the confrontation, admitted that he had been flattered by the attention and had not considered its impact. The moment ended in a tense handshake, but the relationship between them never fully returned to normal. The hierarchy of the locker room began shifting in ways that felt deeply foreign to the culture of the sport. Before the arrival of cameras, leadership developed organically. It emerged from commitment, effort, and emotional consistency. But as team-controlled content and documentary crews continued shaping the public face of organizations, visibility became one of the new factors influencing that hierarchy. Players who were featured prominently gained an unofficial form of influence. Their voices were heard more frequently. Their opinions were discussed more widely. They became symbolic representatives of the team's identity. This influence sometimes conflicted with the real leadership within the team. When the person who appeared as a leader on camera did not match the person who led in the locker room, friction developed. One head coach described this dynamic as an illusion of hierarchy. He said that some players appeared more important in the public eye than they were within the team. He believed this illusion complicated communication. When a player is elevated by visibility rather than performance, other players may feel reluctant to challenge him or hold him accountable. The coach explained that he had to work harder to reinforce the true hierarchy, reminding players that leadership is earned through consistency and commitment, not through camera presence. Resentment also grew among players who believed that the cameras were shaping public perception in ways that harmed their careers. A backup quarterback told me that even though he was performing well in practice, he felt overshadowed by a teammate who had become a fan favorite because of his compelling backstory. He said that the teammate deserved respect, but he also worried that the attention could create unrealistic expectations. He feared that fans would view any decision made by the team through the lens of the narrative rather than through the lens of performance. He said that the pressure to compete against a storyline felt unfair. The locker room, once a place where competition was limited to football, had evolved into a place where emotional and narrative competition existed as well. Players felt the need to be cautious, strategic, and aware of how they appeared in moments that had nothing to do with the sport itself. Some players felt compelled to cultivate a persona. Others felt pressured to fit into roles they never chose. The tension between authenticity and performance deepened. The players who valued privacy felt increasingly uncomfortable. They felt as if their natural quietness placed them at a disadvantage in a world that rewarded visibility. One of the most unexpected consequences of this shift was the emergence of informal alliances. Players who received significant attention often gravitated toward one another. They shared experiences, discussed the challenges of public perception, and sometimes unintentionally separated themselves from the rest of the team. Meanwhile, players who received little attention formed their own bonds, built on the shared feeling of being overshadowed. These groups did not form out of malice, but they created subtle divides within the locker room. The rise of team-controlled content also amplified these divides. When a team's media department focused heavily on certain players, others questioned why their stories were not being told. They asked themselves whether the team valued some personalities more than others. They wondered whether visibility influenced future opportunities. Even when the content team had no intention of creating division, the perception of favoritism began shaping the emotional landscape of the locker room. A veteran cornerback once expressed his frustration by saying that he felt invisible in his own workplace. He knew his teammates respected him. He knew his coaches valued him. But he felt overshadowed by younger players who had become the faces of the team's content strategy. He said it felt strange to walk into a building where the walls displayed images of players who had not yet earned the respect of the locker room. He believed this created confusion about identity, both for the team and for the fans. The most profound consequence of this struggle for visibility was the impact it had on personal relationships. Teammates who had once relied on each other began feeling competitive in ways that had nothing to do with football. They felt jealous of opportunities. They felt protective of their own image. They felt wary of how moments could be interpreted on camera. These feelings did not always result in conflict, but they created a quiet emotional distance that weakened the natural bonds between players. The culture of football had always emphasized unity, resilience, and selflessness. Cameras did not eliminate these values, but they complicated them. They introduced a new layer of emotional negotiation. They forced players to reconcile their desire for authenticity with the desire for recognition. They challenged the idea that teammates were always aligned in purpose. They revealed how fragile the internal ecosystem of a football team can become when external forces shape the way players relate to one another. The story of teammates becoming rivals for airtime is not a condemnation of the players. It is a reflection of how human beings naturally respond to visibility, validation, and public identity. It is a story of how external influence can reshape internal culture. It is a story of how competition can emerge from unexpected sources. And it leads directly into the next transformation that unfolded as cameras continued their steady presence inside NFL facilities. There has always been a quiet subgroup inside every NFL locker room. They are the players who speak softly, work privately, and find comfort in the background rather than the foreground. They are often the glue of a team, the steady hands who arrive early, leave late, and never demand attention. Before cameras entered the building, these players were respected for their discipline and their consistency. They were allowed to exist in peace because the culture of football rewarded reliability more than personality. But when the spotlight entered the locker room, the experience of being a quiet player changed dramatically. The silence that once protected them became a burden. The absence of a public persona became a vulnerability. These players did not seek attention, but attention found them anyway, and many found themselves wrestling with a discomfort they had never known. One offensive lineman described the transition with a tired honesty that stayed with me. He said that he had spent his entire career avoiding cameras. He believed his job required anonymity. The offensive line, after all, is the position group that succeeds best when its members are unseen. They live in the background so that others can thrive. But once documentary crews began entering the locker room, he felt that his space had been invaded. He no longer had moments of solitude. He could not decompress without knowing that a camera might be nearby. He said that the pressure was subtle but constant. It felt as if he was being watched during the moments when he most needed to disappear. Players like him struggled because the modern environment of sports placed unexpected demands on personality. Teams encouraged openness. Fans expected transparency. Producers sought emotional expression. The quiet players who valued privacy found themselves caught between their natural disposition and the expectations of a world driven by visibility. One running back admitted that the presence of cameras changed the way he prepared for games. He said that he felt a tightness in his chest whenever he entered the locker room, worried that a moment of vulnerability might be captured. He wanted to focus, but he felt distracted. He wanted to stay calm, but he felt uneasy. His relationship with the space that once grounded him became strained. The cost of forced visibility was emotional. Many quiet players found themselves withdrawing even further, choosing silence not because it was comfortable, but because it felt safer. They avoided interactions that might draw attention. They avoided conversations with the more outgoing players who attracted producers. They avoided moments that might become content. A defensive back once told me that he skipped voluntary media opportunities even when the requests were reasonable. He said that every interview felt like a performance he did not want to give. He was not shy or insecure. He simply valued privacy. But in a world shaped by visibility, privacy became something he had to defend. This defensive posture created an emotional tension within teams. Players who sought the spotlight were encouraged because their presence benefited the organization's public image. Players who avoided the spotlight felt out of place. Some began questioning whether their personality was compatible with the league's evolving expectations. Others felt guilt because they believed that their reluctance to participate made them appear uncooperative. The quiet players carried a burden that was invisible to most, but painfully real to them. A wide receiver once explained that he felt pressured to show enthusiasm on camera, even though his natural personality was calm and contemplative. He said that the production team often gravitated toward teammates who were loud, expressive, or charismatic. He was none of those things. He understood that his quieter nature made him less appealing for content, but he also felt that his identity was being overlooked. He said that he sometimes forced smiles or exaggerated reactions simply to fit the expectations placed upon him. The experience left him feeling emotionally drained. The cultural shift toward visibility affected relationships as well. Introverted players sometimes felt misunderstood by teammates who embraced the spotlight. Outgoing players occasionally misinterpreted withdrawal as indifference or resentment. The truth was more complicated. The quiet players were not angry. They were overwhelmed. The presence of cameras intensified their natural instinct to protect their inner world. That instinct created distance inside the locker room. not because they lacked loyalty, but because they felt defensive. One of the most profound consequences of forced visibility was the way it reshaped the concept of vulnerability. The locker room had once been a haven where players could express frustration, fear, or exhaustion without judgment. But for quiet players, the presence of cameras made vulnerability feel dangerous. They worried about being misunderstood. They worried about having their emotions edited into a storyline. They worried about becoming the focal point of a narrative they could not control. As a result, many suppressed emotions that needed an outlet. They internalized stress that once would have been released. The quiet players grew quieter. The psychological impact was significant. Some players felt their anxiety increase. Others reported feeling out of sync with the rest of the team. A few considered limiting their engagement with team facilities outside of mandatory activities simply to avoid interactions that involved cameras. One defensive tackle told me that he started staying later at night because the cameras were usually gone by then. He found comfort in the empty training room, where he could stretch, ice his injuries, and reflect without the presence of any observers. He felt that the late hours gave him permission to exist without expectation. Even coaches noticed the change. One assistant coach explained that he could always identify the moment when a quiet player began to retreat. Their eye contact faded. Their interactions became shorter. Their demeanor shifted from calm to cautious. The coach said that he could tell the players were not withdrawing from the team itself, but from the environment created by the constant presence of cameras. He believed that the spotlight created pressure that did not align with the nature of certain personalities. He said that some players carried that pressure silently until it affected their performance. This internal struggle raised questions about the fairness of modern storytelling. The players who thrived in front of cameras gained recognition, influence, and emotional comfort. The players who avoided cameras often felt overlooked, misunderstood, or misplaced. The teams themselves sometimes unknowingly reinforced this dynamic. They highlighted the players with the most engaging personalities. They showcased the players who fit the narrative. They praised openness, but did not always consider how difficult openness can be for those who value privacy. The quiet players were not opposed to storytelling. Many understood its purpose. They understood that fans wanted connection. They understood that transparency supported the league's growth. Their discomfort did not come from disloyalty. It came from the feeling that their personal boundaries were being eroded. They felt as if the cameras asked them to express emotions in a way that contradicted their natural instincts. Some players fulfilled this expectation at great emotional cost. Others resisted, accepting the consequences of invisibility. The most challenging part for these players was the sense that their identity was being reshaped by forces beyond their control. They were no longer simply athletes. They were expected to be personalities. They were expected to generate content. They were expected to help tell the story of the team. For many, this expectation felt unnatural. It violated the solitude that once defined their preparation. It undermined the quiet confidence they had relied upon for years. It disrupted the emotional balance that allowed them to perform at the highest level. The story of the quiet players who hated the spotlight is often overlooked because it does not contain conflict or drama in the traditional sense. It is not loud. It is not explosive. It is not the type of narrative that producers chase. Yet it is one of the most revealing stories of the modern NFL. It shows how the demands of entertainment can affect individuals in ways that are invisible to the audience. It shows how the culture of visibility can unintentionally pressure people who never sought it. And it shows how the push for authenticity can sometimes silence the very players who hold the game's oldest and most honorable values. The experience of these quiet players also shaped the next stage of the evolving dynamic inside the locker room. Their discomfort, their withdrawal, and their emotional struggle revealed the profound consequences of forced visibility. It set the stage for another transformation, one that would complicate the meaning of authenticity even further. There is a moment in every reality-based production when the editors begin shaping the emotional rhythm of the story. They collect hours of footage, sift through conversations, observe subtle gestures, and search for the moments that will define the season's narrative arc. In sports documentaries, this process is especially delicate. The editors do not script events, but they choose which events matter. They choose which personalities rise to the surface and which remain in the background. They choose which tensions deserve attention and which should fade quietly. And sometimes, without meaning to, they choose a villain. In the early years of football storytelling, most players were portrayed with dignity. The narratives focused on perseverance, competition, and teamwork. But as the appetite for emotional intensity grew, producers began to search for sharper edges. Audiences were drawn to conflict. They were drawn to tension. They were drawn to characters whose presence created friction inside the locker room. And when real conflict was limited, the editors began turning small disagreements into emotional turning points. A frustrated gesture became a negative attitude. A single argument became a pattern of behavior. A tired expression became a moment of disrespect. The transformation was subtle but powerful. A player who walked into the season with the respect of his teammates could find himself portrayed as the antagonist without ever understanding why. One linebacker described this experience with a quiet pain that revealed how deeply the narrative had affected him. He said that he had been filmed during a heated moment in training camp. He was frustrated because a rookie had missed an assignment that left the rest of the defense exposed. The moment passed quickly. The two players spoke privately and resolved the issue. But when the episode aired, the scene was edited into a dramatic turning point. Music built around his anger. Cutaway shots emphasized tension. His frustration was isolated from the context that gave it meaning. In the final version, he appeared unreasonable, impatient, and disconnected from his teammates. The viewers interpreted him as the source of division. He said that he barely recognized himself. The emotional fallout hit him harder than he expected. Fans criticized him. Analysts questioned his leadership. Strangers sent messages questioning his character. He said that the scrutiny made him defensive in real life. He noticed teammates looking at him differently, not because they believed the edit, but because they saw the impact it had on him. He began hesitating before speaking in meetings. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He felt as if he had been punished for a version of himself that never actually existed. This experience revealed one of the most profound consequences of football-based storytelling. When editors shape the narrative, players do not control the version of themselves that appears on screen. They may attempt to be thoughtful and disciplined, but a single moment of frustration or a single comment made in exhaustion can be isolated and framed in a way that distorts the truth. The audience consumes that version as reality. And players must live with the shadow of that version even when it does not reflect who they are. Another player, a veteran running back, shared a similar story. He had been filmed during a meeting where he expressed concern about his role in the offense. The conversation was respectful. He spoke openly about his desire to contribute and his fear of being undervalued. The coaches appreciated his honesty, but in the edited version, his words were rearranged to create conflict. The producers wanted tension between him and the coaching staff, so they cut away from the supportive responses and highlighted only the moments where he appeared frustrated. The final result made him look selfish. He said that he watched the episode with disbelief. He could not understand how a constructive conversation had been reshaped into a dramatic storyline. The emotional cost of this transformation extended far beyond embarrassment. He said that when he walked into the facility the following day, he felt a distance that had not been there before. Teammates assured him they knew the truth, but he could feel the weight of the narrative pressing against him. He wondered whether coaches would subconsciously view him differently. He wondered whether his reputation around the league would suffer. He wondered whether teams considering him for future contracts might see the episode and question his attitude. His fear was not irrational. In a profession where perception influences opportunity, a single distorted storyline can alter a career. The most painful part of being edited into a villain is the sense of helplessness. Players cannot correct the narrative once it reaches the public. They cannot explain the context. They cannot rebut the storyline without appearing defensive. They cannot confront the editors. They must live with a version of themselves that was created for entertainment rather than truth. Some players attempt to brush off the experience. They remind themselves that editing is not personal. They try to view it as part of the industry. But privately, many admit that the portrayal leaves marks they struggle to erase. The psychological impact extends to how players behave in future seasons. Those who are edited negatively often become hyper-aware of their behavior. They measure their words carefully. They avoid emotional expression. They hesitate before engaging in conversations that might be misinterpreted. A defensive end once said that after being portrayed as difficult, he deliberately softened his personality on camera. He avoided expressing frustration. He avoided confronting teammates. He avoided anything that might be misunderstood. He said that he felt as if he had been conditioned by the narrative. His authenticity was replaced by caution. The influence of editing also created subtle divisions inside teams. When a player was portrayed negatively, some teammates felt protective, while others felt distant. A few questioned whether the portrayal reflected hidden truths. Even when teammates supported the player, the environment shifted. They knew the public narrative had changed. They knew fans would view the player differently. They knew the weight of perception would follow him throughout the season. These shifts were not intentional, but they altered the emotional chemistry of the locker room. The coaches felt the effects as well. A coach once explained that when a player is portrayed as a problem, he must spend additional time protecting that player from external scrutiny. He must reassure the team that the portrayal is inaccurate. He must navigate the public narrative while privately maintaining trust. He said that the editing of reality-based programming sometimes created challenges that did not exist before the cameras arrived. He believed that the narrative often shaped public opinion more powerfully than performance. The deeper truth behind the edited villain is that the role is often created through the absence of context rather than the presence of wrongdoing. Football players live in an environment fueled by intensity. They experience fatigue, frustration, and pressure. Their emotions fluctuate. They speak passionately. They confront problems directly. These qualities are part of the nature of the sport. But when editors isolate these moments and remove the surrounding context, passion becomes hostility. Leadership becomes conflict. Honesty becomes defiance. The transformation is unintentional but impactful. Some players learn to accept the possibility that they might become the antagonist in a season-as storyline. They remind themselves that it does not reflect their reality. They rely on their teammates for support. They trust that their character will prevail over perception. But other players struggle deeply with the emotional weight of the portrayal. They feel misunderstood. They feel misrepresented. They feel as if the narrative has robbed them of their identity. The most telling aspect of the edited villain phenomenon is the way it exposes the fragile boundary between entertainment and truth. Reality-based storytelling seeks authenticity, but it also seeks structure. It seeks narrative arcs, emotional tension, and memorable characters. When these elements conflict with the complexity of real people, the truth becomes vulnerable. The players who find themselves edited into villains are not flawed or dramatic individuals. They are human beings captured in moments of normal emotion. They are professionals navigating an environment of high stakes and constant scrutiny. Their portrayal as antagonists is not a reflection of their character. It is a reflection of a system that prioritizes story over nuance. The consequences of these portrayals shaped the next stage of the evolving dynamic inside the locker room. As players grappled with being cast into roles they did not choose, the psychological burden deepened. And it set the stage for a more personal battle that would unfold next. There is a quiet truth that has followed the rise of cameras inside NFL facilities. A truth that many players speak about only when the building is empty and the day has finally loosened its grip. It is the truth that exposure changes the emotional landscape of the sport. It reshapes the psychology of the athletes. It amplifies pressure in ways that statistics cannot measure. Football has always demanded physical resilience, but the modern game demands emotional resilience of equal intensity. When every gesture, every comment, and every moment can be captured, interpreted, and broadcast, the players find themselves carrying a weight that extends far beyond the field. In the age of exposure, mental health became one of the quiet battlegrounds within the locker room. One player described the feeling as living under a constant evaluation that never stops. He said that practice used to be a place of learning. Mistakes were corrected privately. Hard coaching was accepted because it stayed within the team. But with cameras present, the margin for emotional error shrank. He knew that a single frustrated expression could be interpreted as weakness or negativity. He knew that a moment of vulnerability could become a storyline. He said that the pressure created a sense of emotional surveillance. It was not enough to perform on the field. He felt compelled to perform emotionally as well. The anxiety that emerged from this environment was profound. Players began to second-guess their reactions. They monitored their body language. They noticed the presence of cameras, even when they tried to ignore them. A young cornerback once told me that he felt a spike of anxiety every time he walked into the facility because he worried that his emotions might betray him. He said that the pressure to appear composed made him feel disconnected from himself. He felt as if he was constantly tightening an internal grip that he could not release. That anxiety followed him into meetings, into practice, and into his home life. He struggled to sleep. He struggled to relax. The sport that had once been his refuge began to feel like a source of dread. Depression also entered the lives of players who found themselves exposed to levels of public scrutiny they were not prepared for. Many athletes are taught from a young age that strength means endurance. That emotion must be tucked behind effort, and that struggles must remain private. But when cameras magnified their mistakes and the public reacted with judgment, the internal walls that once protected them began to weaken. A wide receiver who had been edited into a negative storyline admitted that he spiraled into depression during the season. He said that he felt cornered by a version of himself that he could not escape. Fans criticized him for moments that had been taken out of context. Analysts questioned his character. He tried to stay focused on football, but the noise became impossible to ignore. He said that he would drive home after practice and sit in his car in silence because he could not bring himself to enter the house. He felt heavy. He felt misunderstood. He felt as if he had lost control of his own identity. He tried to hide his depression from teammates because he feared that any sign of emotional struggle would be interpreted as weakness. He said that the hardest part was pretending to be fine in front of cameras that captured his every move. It felt like acting in a life he no longer recognized. The pressure of public perception did not affect only those who were portrayed negatively. Even players who received positive attention experienced psychological strain. One running back explained that he felt trapped by the persona that fans celebrated. The cameras showed him as confident, charismatic, and unshakable. He appreciated the admiration, but privately he struggled with insecurity. He worried constantly about living up to the image that had been created for him. The praise felt like a shadow that followed him everywhere, reminding him that he could not falter. He said that he would wake up in the middle of the night thinking about how one bad game might change the way fans viewed him. He worried that the cameras might capture him on a day when he felt exhausted or discouraged. He felt afraid of disappointing the version of himself that existed in the public eye. This disconnect created emotional friction inside him. He knew that the persona was a simplified version of his real identity, and the pressure to maintain it left him feeling hollow. The constant attention felt suffocating. This divide between the athlete and the persona became one of the most complicated psychological challenges in the modern NFL. Players were no longer judged solely on performance. They were judged on personality, expression, openness, and emotional appeal. Many players found themselves living with two identities. One identity was the athlete, shaped by discipline, competitiveness, and the private realities of the sport. The other identity was the persona, shaped by cameras, editing decisions, social media reactions, and public expectations. A quarterback explained the burden of this duality with remarkable clarity. He said that being an NFL quarterback already came with immense pressure because the position demands responsibility for the success of the entire team. But the presence of cameras amplified that pressure. He felt that he was not just leading a team, but performing leadership for an audience. He worried that if he appeared too frustrated, fans would question his composure. If he appeared too calm, fans would question his passion. He felt trapped between contradictory expectations. The persona demanded perfection. The athlete knew perfection was impossible. This emotional conflict created exhaustion that players rarely spoke about publicly. They felt responsible not only for their own performance, but also for the story being told about them. They feared that any misstep could shape a narrative that would follow them for years. They felt judged by millions of people who did not know them. They worried that the persona could overshadow their true character. The pressure seeped into their daily lives. The toll on relationships was significant. Some players withdrew from teammates because they feared emotional exposure. Others became overly cautious in their interactions, worried that their words might be taken out of context. A few isolated themselves from friends and family because they felt too overwhelmed to connect. The emotional strain fractured communication not only within teams, but also within personal lives. The constant exposure weakened bonds that players desperately needed for support. Teams began noticing the rise in mental health struggles. Some organizations expanded resources for counseling and therapy. Others encouraged players to discuss their feelings more openly, but the presence of cameras complicated these efforts. Many players refused therapy sessions when they knew that they're emotional. Vulnerability could be discovered or interpreted by the public. They carried burdens in silence because they felt safer hiding than risking exposure. One trainer told me that he could always tell when a player was struggling with depression. The player stopped laughing at the small moments that once brought relief. The light behind his eyes dimmed. He moved through the facility with a heaviness that was impossible to ignore. The trainer believed that the emotional environment created by constant exposure contributed to these struggles. The pressure felt relentless. The players could not escape it even when they wanted to. The age of exposure transformed football into a psychological test far beyond the physical demands of the sport. The emotional cost of being watched, judged, interpreted, and analyzed affected every layer of a player's life. It influenced performance. It influenced relationships. It influenced identity. The athletes who once entered the locker room seeking refuge now entered cautiously, aware that their emotional landscape had become part of the entertainment. The truth is that mental health challenges did not emerge because football changed. They emerged because the world surrounding football changed. Cameras entered spaces that once belonged exclusively to the players. Storytelling shaped perceptions that influenced careers. The demand for visibility reshaped the demands placed on the athletes. The players learned to perform not only on the field, but in life. And that performance carried a cost they could not always bear. The emotional fallout of exposure became one of the defining struggles of the modern NFL. It set the stage for the next chapter in this story. A chapter that examined how players attempted to reclaim their identity in a world that constantly tried to shape it for them. Every NFL season begins with a fresh wave of rookies stepping into a world they have dreamed about since childhood. They arrive carrying hope, fear, ambition, and the weight of expectations that come from years of sacrifice by themselves and their families. In earlier eras, the challenges they faced were familiar. They had to earn the trust of veterans. They had to learn the playbook. They had to adjust to the speed and physicality of the professional game. They had to prove that they belonged. But in the age of cameras and constant storytelling, rookies inherited a new burden that generations before them never experienced. They were not just learning to be professional athletes. They were learning to become public figures, often before they had even taken a meaningful snap. They stepped into the league as players, but many were quickly treated as characters, expected to entertain, perform, and reveal themselves to an audience eager to create stars long before they earned their place. A rookie's first training camp used to be a private initiation. They were allowed to make mistakes in obscurity. They could stumble, hesitate, ask questions, and quietly absorb the professional environment around them. But when cameras entered camp, that privacy disappeared. Every misstep could become a moment of content. Every reaction could be interpreted as personality. A confused expression during a meeting might be framed as a lack of preparation. A quiet demeanor might be portrayed as aloofness. A moment of confidence might be inflated into a narrative of early stardom. The young players found themselves constantly observed, often at the stage of their career when they were least prepared for public attention. One rookie running back explained that he felt overwhelmed from the moment he stepped into the facility. He had expected pressure from coaches, pressure from teammates, and pressure from the speed of the game. But he had not expected pressure from a camera crew he had never met. He said that the cameras followed him through early drills because he was a highly anticipated draft pick. He felt flattered, but he also felt uncomfortable. He was still adjusting to the playbook. He was still learning the expectations of his position coach. He was still figuring out where he belonged. Yet the cameras captured him as if he were already a significant figure. The disconnect created a sense of internal conflict. He felt as if he had been pushed into a role he did not yet understand. The pressure to perform did not apply only to athletic ability. Rookies often felt pressured to perform personality. The modern media environment rewards expression. It rewards charisma. It rewards emotional openness. Producers often look for rookies who can create memorable moments. The rookies who express frustration become sympathetic. The rookies who express confidence become compelling. The rookies who express fear become relatable. But the rookies who remain quiet often struggle to navigate the expectations placed upon them. A rookie offensive lineman once said that he felt invisible because he was not naturally expressive. He did not dislike the cameras, but he did not know how to act around them. He worried that his quietness would be misinterpreted as indifference. He worried that his reluctance to engage would hurt his public reputation before he even saw game action. The emotional pressure created by this environment often felt heavier than the physical demands of training camp. Young players tried to balance authenticity with expectation. Some attempted to be themselves, only to learn that their natural personalities did not create compelling content. Others attempted to adapt, exaggerating reactions or forcing conversations to appear more engaging. This performance quickly became exhausting. One rookie wide receiver admitted that he would go home after practice and feel drained, not from the physical work, but from the emotional effort of trying to appear interesting. He said that he felt trapped between who he was and who he was expected to be. Veterans noticed this shift and often felt protective of the younger players. Many veterans had entered the league before exposure became constant. They remembered what it felt like to develop in relative obscurity. They saw how the pressure on rookies grew heavier each year. One veteran safety explained that he worried about the mental health of first-year players who were not prepared for the dual burden of performing on the field and performing for the cameras. He said that rookies already carry enormous self-doubt, and the added pressure of public perception could break them before they had a chance to settle into the league. The cameras also created tension among rookies themselves. Young players are always in competition. They compete for playing time, for roles, for roster spots, and for the trust of the coaching staff. But in the modern era, they also compete for visibility. The rookie who receives the most attention often becomes the face of the rookie class. He becomes the player fans root for. He becomes the player analysts focus on. The others feel the pressure of comparison. A rookie linebacker described this tension when he said that he felt overshadowed by a teammate whose personality naturally attracted producers. He respected his teammate. But he could not ignore the growing frustration he felt when fans recognized the other rookie but had no idea who he was. The presence of cameras also magnified the emotional vulnerability of rookies. Many have never lived alone. Many have never been away from family support systems. Many have never handled large sums of money, widespread attention, or high-level criticism. They are thrust into adulthood under the brightest possible lights. A rookie cornerback said that he felt emotionally fragile during his first year. He said that he would cry alone at night because he felt overwhelmed by expectations he did not fully understand. He had no issue with hard coaching, but he felt suffocated by the pressure to be accessible to fans and cameras at a moment when he barely understood the scheme. He felt pulled in every direction, unable to find solid ground. This vulnerability extended into social media. When rookies appear on camera, they attract immediate attention online. Fans analyze their expressions. Critics evaluate their comments. Strangers form opinions based on small moments captured in documentary episodes. Many rookies read these opinions because they crave validation. Some find encouragement, but many find negativity. A rookie defensive tackle once shared that he stopped reading comments after he saw fans mocking him for appearing nervous in a team meeting. He said that the mockery made him doubt whether he belonged in the league. He said that the power of public criticism affected him more deeply than any missed assignment or failed rep. The pressure intensified for rookies who entered the league as first-round picks. The cameras gravitated toward them immediately. They felt pressure to justify their draft status before they even took a snap. Some thrived under this scrutiny, but others felt crushed by it. A highly drafted quarterback once said that he feared every mistake he made in practice because he knew that fans and producers expected perfection. He was learning the most complex playbook of his life, yet he felt judged for every hesitation. He said that he felt as if he was taking an exam that millions of people could see, even though he was only at the beginning of his development. Coaches tried to protect rookies by restricting certain camera access, but protection only went so far. The public wanted stories. The league encouraged access. Teams needed engagement. The rookies became the natural subjects of attention because their stories represented possibility. But the young players rarely understood how this exposure would shape their emotional landscape. They experienced moments of pride when fans supported them. They experienced moments of fear when they saw themselves portrayed in ways they did not expect. They experienced moments of confusion when they felt torn between the demands of development and the demands of visibility. The rookies who struggled most often felt that they were losing control of their identity. They were still discovering who they were as professionals, yet the public had already formed opinions. They felt trapped in narratives that did not reflect their complexity. They felt pressured to smile, pressured to speak, pressured to reveal parts of themselves that were not ready to be seen. Many rookies admitted that they longed for a time when they could simply learn the game without feeling watched. They wanted the space to grow privately. They wanted the chance to make mistakes without those mistakes becoming part of a story. But the modern NFL does not offer that luxury. The rookies who enter today inherit a world shaped by cameras, editing, and the hunger for behind-the-scenes access. They inherit a culture where personality can influence opportunity. They inherit a profession where the emotional cost of exposure is as real as the physical cost of contact. And they must navigate this landscape while trying not to lose themselves in the process. The hidden pressure on rookies is one of the most revealing chapters of the modern NFL. It exposes the emotional complexity of starting a career in a world that demands performance on every level. It shows how vulnerable young players can be beneath the surface of confidence. And it leads into the next stage of the story, where the pressure of visibility begins to shape not only players, but the very structure of team leadership. There was a time in the NFL when conflict lived and died inside the building. Disagreements happened every day. Tempers flared during practice. Words were exchanged in meeting rooms. Competitive tension pulsed through the locker room, especially during training camp when every rep felt like a battle for survival. These moments were ordinary. They were part of the emotional landscape of the sport. Players confronted each other, resolved issues, and moved on. Relationships strengthened through those confrontations because they were rooted in honesty. But once cameras entered the facility and producers searched for storylines capable of holding an audience, conflict became something else entirely. It became content. And the moment conflict became content, the meaning of disagreements inside the locker room changed. Players quickly learned that the presence of cameras transformed even minor tensions into potential episodes. A sharp exchange between teammates that once would have been forgotten by the afternoon could now define a segment in a documentary series. Producers did not need to fabricate drama. They simply needed to isolate the heated seconds that occurred naturally in a competitive environment and present them without the context that would normally soften them. Conflict became a narrative tool. A disagreement became a hook. A frustrated reaction became an emotional turning point. Then the players who lived through those moments began to feel the weight of exposure in ways they never anticipated. One defensive back shared a story that captured the emotional complexity of this transformation. He said that he had confronted a teammate during a practice after a missed assignment forced him into a dangerous collision with another player. His reaction was intense, but brief. He cared deeply about the standard of the defense and wanted the mistake corrected immediately. The argument lasted less than a minute. They apologized afterward and continued practicing with no lingering resentment. But when the episode aired, the argument became the centerpiece. The editors framed it as evidence of a growing divide within the secondary. The narrative suggested that the players did not trust each other. The defensive back said that he felt blindsided by the portrayal. He said that the conflict had no lasting significance, yet it became a defining moment in the public story of the season. The most painful part of the experience was the effect it had on his relationship with his teammate. They had moved on from the issue instantly. But when the episode aired, fans and analysts discussed the argument as if it represented deep, underlying tension. The teammate received messages asking whether he felt disrespected. Reporters questioned both players about their relationship. Defensive back said that he felt the need to defend a situation that never required defending. A moment that should have remained private transformed into something larger than life. It created discomfort between the two players, not because of the disagreement itself, but because of the public attention that followed. This distortion became a recurring pattern. Players who experienced brief moments of frustration suddenly found themselves cast into roles they never expected to play. Teammates who spoke honestly during meetings discovered that producers gravitated toward their strongest emotions. A receiver who raised his voice in a film session found that the cameras captured only the tension, not the resolution. A lineman who expressed anger after a poor scrimmage found his frustration turned into the emotional climax of an episode. In each case, the relationship between the players involved was misrepresented, reshaped, or strained by the editorial choices made after the fact. The distortion extended to the perception of leadership. A coach once explained that part of his job was to challenge players in ways that demanded emotional responses. He pushed them because he cared. He confronted them because accountability required intensity. But when these moments were captured on camera, they were often stripped of the trust that existed between coach and player. The public saw tension without the years of relationship that gave it meaning. This misinterpretation created friction in the professional world, but it also created discomfort in the personal one. Coaches worried that players would feel exposed or undermined by the portrayal. Players feared that coaches might hesitate to challenge them in the future because of how those moments might appear in a documentary. The emotional impact on players was significant. One linebacker explained that he began moderating his behavior during competitive drills because he feared that any heated moment might be used for entertainment. He valued authenticity, but he became cautious. He found himself holding back frustration instead of addressing it directly. This hesitation weakened communication within the defense. issues that once would have been resolved instantly now lingered. The desire to avoid becoming a storyline complicated the natural flow of accountability. Another player said that the presence of cameras changed the way he interpreted conflict itself. He found himself questioning whether a teammate's emotional reaction was genuine or influenced by the presence of cameras. He wondered whether certain arguments were intensified because players understood that dramatic moments would attract attention. He wondered whether teammates sometimes used conflict as a way to stand out. These doubts chipped away at trust. They created layers of uncertainty that did not exist in earlier eras. The distortion of relationships extended far beyond the immediate conflict. When players were portrayed negatively during arguments, fans formed opinions about their character. Those opinions often lasted longer than the conflict itself. A player who was shown arguing in a single episode might carry the label of being difficult or emotional for years. The public did not see the follow-up conversations. They did not see the apologies, the laughter, the moments of unity that followed. They saw only the edited version, and that version shaped perception in ways that were impossible to undo. The emotional cost of conflict as content also influenced how players interacted with the production staff. Many players developed a cautious respect for the cameras, but others developed a sense of distrust. They believed that the production teams were not intentionally harmful, but they felt that the storytelling demands of the industry required them to focus on conflict. A veteran lineman said that the producers seemed eager to capture heated moments because they provided emotional energy for the episodes. He said that he understood the purpose, but he also believed that the approach chipped away at the authenticity of relationships. Players became wary of expressing raw emotion in front of the cameras, fearing that those moments would be misinterpreted or sensationalized. The distortion extended into the way teams were perceived as a whole. When conflicts were highlighted, the public sometimes believed that the team lacked cohesion. Fans questioned leadership. Analysts speculated about chemistry issues. These narratives often had little connection to reality, but their persistence affected morale. Players felt frustrated when they were forced to defend their relationships publicly. Coaches felt frustrated when the narrative assigned meaning to conflicts that were common and healthy within the sport. The pressure to correct these misinterpretations added another layer of emotional labor to an already demanding environment. Despite the challenges, conflict remained an unavoidable part of the game. Football is an emotional sport. Players push their bodies and minds to the limit. Tension is inevitable, but the players knew that conflict was meant to be resolved privately, not documented and amplified. The transformation of conflict into content created a disconnect between the natural, emotional rhythms of the team and the storyline presented to the public. The greatest harm came from the way these portrayals influenced the future behavior of players. Some became quieter. Some became more guarded. Some began avoiding confrontation entirely. The authentic communication that once strengthened teams became filtered through considerations of visibility. Players navigated disagreements with caution. They chose their words carefully. They worried that any sharp exchange might be misinterpreted. The natural emotional honesty that once defined football culture became softened, reshaped, or withheld. The story of conflict as content reveals the profound impact that cameras can have on the relationships within a team. It exposes the tension between narrative and truth, between entertainment and authenticity, between storytelling and the lived experiences of the players. It shows how the desire for compelling episodes can distort the reality of human connection. And it leads directly into the next chapter of this documentary, where the quiet consequences of exposure begin shaping the deeper emotional identity of the locker room. There was a moment in NFL history when the cameras were simply observers. They existed to document, not to influence. They captured what happened, but never shaped what would happen next. That era faded quickly. As access expanded and storylines became part of the league's weekly rhythm, the cameras did more than record. They began to affect the strategic heartbeat of football. Coaches felt the shift long before anyone spoke openly about it. They saw the subtle ways the presence of cameras altered decision-making, emotional expression, competitive secrecy, and the honesty required to prepare a team for the demands of the season. The transformation was not loud. It did not arrive with confrontation. It seeped into the fabric of daily operations until coaches realized that their playbooks and their philosophies were being shaped by forces far outside the sport. The first sign appeared in meeting rooms. Head coaches had always conducted their strategy sessions with complete transparency. They dissected opponent tendencies, identified weaknesses within their own roster, and challenged players to improve. These meetings contained the raw truth of football. Mistakes were exposed. Effort was questioned. Assignments were corrected. Nothing was filtered. But when cameras entered those rooms, even with limited access, coaches felt an immediate shift. They hesitated before criticizing players with the same intensity they once used. They paused before revealing strategic insights. They spoke with more caution, aware that a single recorded phrase could be interpreted out of context or projected to the public in a way that affected competitive advantage. One head coach shared that he began holding two versions of certain meetings. There was the meeting with cameras present, where the tone was measured and the details were broad. Then there was the meeting without cameras, where the real work happened. He did not resent the cameras. He understood the league's desire for access. But he believed that strategy required privacy. He said that football demanded honesty that could only exist behind closed doors. When he sensed that his players were filtering their reactions because they knew they were being recorded, he realized that the presence of cameras was reshaping his ability to coach freely. This change extended onto the practice field. Teams once practiced complex plays openly, without worrying about who might see them. But with cameras documenting portions of practice for internal and external content, coaches began removing certain plays from film segments. They protected specialized packages. They withheld trick plays. They kept red zone variations off limits. The fear was not paranoid. The league is built on competitive margins measured in inches, tendencies, personnel alignments, and emotional cues. Coaches knew that any information captured on film could eventually shape an opponent's preparation. Even if the footage never left the building, they feared that enough eyes on the material increased the chance of leaks or misinterpretation. A defensive coordinator said that he stopped explaining the full logic behind certain coverage disguises when cameras were present. He offered general motivation but saved the complex details for private conversations. He did this not because he feared the production team, but because he understood that every piece of recorded material became part of a larger ecosystem of storytelling. The cameras created a layer of vulnerability that complicated competitive secrecy. He felt responsible for protecting the integrity of his scheme. He also felt the frustration of knowing that the presence of cameras forced him to hold back information that would have benefited players if shared openly. Players felt these strategic limitations as well. They noticed when coaches adjusted their tone or withheld detail. Some players understood the decision, while others felt confused about why certain aspects of the game were discussed cryptically. A veteran tight end said that he eventually learned to recognize when a coach was giving a camera version of an explanation. He could sense the measured tone and the lack of specificity. He would wait until the cameras left before asking for the real answer. He said that the practice created a strange duality inside the team environment. The openness required for winning was competing with the caution required for maintaining privacy. The presence of cameras also influenced how players handled injuries. In earlier eras, players were hesitant to reveal injuries because they feared losing their role. When cameras became part of the environment, another layer of concern emerged. Some players feared that their injuries would become narrative angles. They worried that producers might frame their pain as weakness or use their struggle to shape a storyline that did not reflect the full truth. A linebacker once said that he played through a painful wrist injury during training camp because he did not want the cameras to capture him favoring it. He feared that the footage might lead fans to question his toughness. He feared that his coaches might be perceived as protecting him even when he wanted to compete. He believed that the cameras created an additional pressure to appear invulnerable. This pressure caused players to hide injuries not only from the cameras, but sometimes from the training staff. A young defensive tackle admitted that he delayed reporting a groin strain because he feared that the cameras would focus on his absence from practice. He did not want to become the rookie who struggled with early injuries. He believed that the narrative would follow him throughout the season. He later regretted the decision when the injury worsened and forced him to miss games. He said that the internal conflict he felt between honesty and public perception created confusion he had never experienced before. The impact reached even further. Coaches began altering their emotional expression because they understood that the cameras could capture moments that might be misinterpreted. A coach who raised his voice in a meeting might be portrayed as angry rather than passionate. A coach who challenged a star player might be seen as creating unnecessary drama. A coach who used tough love could be portrayed as undermining confidence. These portrayals affected public perception, but more importantly, they affected the relationships within the team. Some coaches admitted that they avoided confrontations they once believed were necessary because they feared the storyline that might emerge. Players noticed these changes as well. They sensed when a coach softened his approach. They sensed when a difficult conversation was postponed. They sensed when the emotional energy of a practice felt different. These subtle adjustments created confusion. One receiver said that he felt unsure whether feedback was being filtered. He wanted honesty, even when it hurt. He wanted clarity, even when it was uncomfortable. But he felt that the presence of cameras changed the natural rhythm of communication. He said that he missed the raw authenticity of earlier eras when emotion flowed without hesitation. The cameras also shaped how teams handled internal disagreements. Some conflicts were left unresolved because players feared that any conversation might be documented. Others were resolved quietly outside the building because players wanted privacy. A defensive end once said that he confronted a teammate privately in the parking lot instead of during practice because he did not want the cameras to misinterpret their conversation. He believed that the cameras could turn even constructive discussions into dramatic moments. The shift from open dialogue to cautious navigation affected trust and communication. Another layer of complexity emerged from the way teams structured their weekly routines. Some organizations created specific windows where cameras were allowed. Others created designated spaces where cameras were not permitted. But even with restrictions, the presence of cameras shaped the emotional atmosphere of the building. Players and coaches felt as if they were moving through zones rather than a unified environment. Some spaces felt safe for honesty. Others felt like stages. The unevenness affected how freely individuals could express themselves. One special teams coach described the situation as a constant negotiation between truth and protection. He said that every day required a calculation regarding what could be said openly and what needed to be said privately. He believed that this negotiation created emotional fatigue that affected both players and coaches. He believed that the sport thrived on clarity, and the presence of cameras introduced a layer of ambiguity that complicated leadership. The impact extended into game preparation as well. Teams began crafting selective narratives for the episodes they knew would be produced. They attempted to highlight unity, effort, and identity, while minimizing moments that could be taken out of context. The effort was not dishonest. It was protective, but it changed the internal culture by adding a layer of performance to an environment that was once fully private. When cameras begin shaping strategy, the nature of the sport evolves. The game remains the same, but the emotional and strategic environment surrounding it becomes filtered. Coaches protect information. Players protect themselves. Conversations shift from open to cautious. Authenticity becomes a currency that must be guarded. And the very building designed to foster honesty becomes a place where truth must compete with the demands of narrative. This shift set the stage for the next development in the story. where the influence of exposure moved beyond strategy and began shaping the emotional fabric of the team at a deeper level. There is a particular kind of vulnerability that enters a player's life when the cameras turn toward their family. For years, the locker room had been the center of football storytelling. But over time, the lens expanded, reaching into the homes, marriages, and childhoods that shaped the men behind the jerseys. Producers understood that fans connected deeply with personal stories. They wanted glimpses of the tender moments, the celebrations, the sacrifices, and the quiet struggles that defined life beyond the field. What began as a way to humanize players eventually evolved into something more complicated, something that blurred the boundaries between private life and public consumption. Families who never signed up for the spotlight became part of the narrative, sometimes willingly, sometimes reluctantly, and always with emotional consequences that rippled through the lives of the people closest to the players. Many athletes entered the league believing that their personal lives would remain separate from their careers. They knew that football required public visibility, but they believed that their homes would remain sanctuaries. They believed that their children would grow up outside the glare of cameras. They believed that their partners would be able to live quietly, free from the weight of public judgment. But the rise of reality-based football programming changed that expectation. The family angle became a powerful storytelling tool, and players quickly learned that the people they loved were being drawn into the narrative, whether they felt ready or not. One quarterback described the moment he realized that his family had become part of the show. He said that he returned home after practice to find a camera crew filming his wife preparing dinner and his children completing homework. He had agreed to limited home access for a feature, but he did not anticipate the emotional effect it would have. He said that his wife tried to appear comfortable, but he could sense her tension. She worried about being judged for things that were entirely normal. She worried about appearing overwhelmed. She worried about their children being exposed to scrutiny. The quarterback said that he felt a mix of pride and guilt. Pride because he loved his family and wanted the world to see their strength. Guilt because he realized that he had invited cameras into a space that was supposed to protect them. Families reacted differently to the spotlight. Some embraced the visibility. They enjoyed showing their lives, celebrating the journey, and connecting with fans. Others felt fragile under its weight. A linebacker's wife once explained that she felt as if she had lost control of her own story. People she had never met formed opinions about her marriage, her parenting, and her personality based on brief moments captured on camera. She said that she read comments online at first, hoping to find encouragement, but eventually she stopped reading because the criticism was too painful. Strangers judged her reactions, her tone, her appearance, and her behavior. She said that the scrutiny made her feel isolated. Children felt the effects in ways that were subtle but lasting. Some enjoyed the attention, especially at young ages when the idea of appearing on television felt exciting. But as they grew older, they became aware of the emotional pressures attached to their parents' career. A veteran safety described the guilt he felt when his teenage daughter told him that she did not like being filmed. She said that she felt self-conscious about how she looked and worried that her classmates would tease her. She said that the presence of cameras in their home made her feel as if she could not fully relax. The safety said that the conversation opened his eyes to the emotional complexity of blending family life with public storytelling. Another player shared that his son, who was usually energetic and playful, became unusually quiet whenever the cameras appeared. He believed that the child sensed the need to behave differently, even though no one asked him to. He said that the sight of his son trying to regulate his behavior made him question whether the exposure was worth the cost. He wondered whether the desire for authenticity on screen could ever justify the emotional discomfort it caused his family. The family angle also created tension within marriages. Partners often felt pressure to appear supportive, calm, and composed, even when the reality of football life was far more complicated. Injuries, uncertainty, fatigue, and the fear of career instability weighed heavily on players and their families alike. When cameras captured family interactions, many felt obligated to hide those fears. One offensive lineman's wife confessed that she felt emotionally conflicted during filming. On one hand, she wanted to support her husband and contribute to the narrative. On the other hand, she felt that she had to suppress her own anxiety about his job security. She said that she smiled for the camera while carrying a fear that he might be cut before the season began. She said that pretending to be calm felt like an emotional performance she never chose. Players felt protective of their families, but they also understood the public value of family-centered storytelling. They knew that fans connected deeply with personal narratives. They understood that teams benefited from showing the human side of their athletes. Some players felt torn between their loyalty to their families and their loyalty to the organization. They did not want to deny access, but they also did not want to expose their families to emotional strain. This conflict created stress that players rarely discussed, even among teammates. The emotional impact stretched further when the family stories involved hardship. When cameras captured moments of struggle, such as financial stress, medical challenges, or marital tension, the players often felt vulnerable in ways they had not anticipated. One running back described the discomfort he felt when an episode highlighted his mother's financial difficulties. He had agreed to share the story because he wanted to honor her sacrifices. But he did not expect the public to analyze her life with such intensity. He said that he felt protective and ashamed, not because of her situation, but because of how strangers reacted to it. He felt as if the public had taken ownership of a deeply personal part of his life. Another dimension of the family angle emerged through the way producers shaped emotional arcs. Families were often used to illustrate player motivation, resilience, and heart. These portrayals were usually positive, but they also simplified complex relationships. A player who struggled with balancing football and family life might appear one-dimensional or overly sentimental on camera. A spouse who supported the player through adversity might be reduced to symbolic encouragement. Children might be portrayed as inspiration, even when they did not fully understand their parents' struggles. These portrayals were not malicious, but they often lacked the nuance that defined real family life. The pressure on families also intensified during moments of uncertainty. When a player was on the verge of being cut, cameras often captured the emotional buildup at home. Wives and partners expressed fear. Children sensed stress. The tension became part of the episode, creating suspense that attracted viewers. But for the families, the experience felt deeply personal. One player said that watching the episode depicting his release felt like reliving the most painful moment of his career. He said that seeing his children cry on screen was overwhelming. He respected the production team, but he questioned whether the exposure had crossed a line. In some cases, families became so entrenched in the storytelling that they developed their own following. This created additional pressure to maintain a public image. One receiver said that his wife became recognized in public, which made her self-conscious. She felt obligated to appear composed even when she felt emotional strain. She appreciated the support of fans, but she also felt the weight of visibility. The receiver said that he felt responsible for placing his family in that position, even though he believed that he had made the right decision at the time. Despite these challenges, many families supported the storytelling process because they believed it helped humanize the athletes. They wanted fans to understand the emotional depth of football life. They wanted to show the sacrifices behind the scenes. They believed that the stories they shared could inspire others. But even when the intentions were positive, the emotional cost remained. The family angle revealed one of the deeper truths of modern football storytelling. The sport no longer existed only on the field or inside the locker room. It extended into kitchens, living rooms, bedrooms, and backyards. The desire for authenticity drew families into the spotlight, but authenticity came with a price. The people closest to the players carried emotional burdens that viewers rarely recognized. They navigated pressures they never sought. They became part of storylines they did not write. This chapter in the evolution of behind-the-scenes football coverage opened the door to the next development. where the emotional weight of exposure extended beyond individuals and families and began shaping the collective identity of entire organizations. There was a time when the locker room existed as a sacred space, a place untouched by external influence where players could shed their armor, release the tension of the field, and speak openly with teammates and coaches. That space has always been central to the culture of football. It was where trust was built, where leadership emerged naturally, and where the emotional honesty of the sport could breathe freely. The entrance of cameras changed the dynamic. But behind those cameras, another force began to assert itself, a presence far more subtle and influential than the visible lenses. The producer? The producer became the invisible hand guiding the story, selecting moments, framing narratives, and shaping how players, coaches, and the audience perceive the realities of the locker room. In many ways, the producer held more influence over the culture of the team than anyone realized. Producers were not present to interfere with play calling or coaching decisions, but their role in narrative construction introduced new behavioral pressures. Players began to recognize that moments of emotion, conflict, or vulnerability might be captured and repurposed. A producer might suggest angles for interviews, suggest capturing a particular reaction, or subtly encourage participants to share stories in ways that heightened drama. The effect was quiet, but pervasive. Players found themselves questioning their natural instincts, moderating behavior, and reconsidering how they responded in moments that once would have been raw and unfiltered. The locker room, which had once been a safe haven, began to feel like a stage where every emotion could be dissected, repurposed, and broadcast. Veteran players spoke candidly about the tension created by producers' presence. One veteran linebacker said that he noticed a shift in how young players interacted with him. They became more cautious in their responses, more self-conscious, more concerned about how a heated exchange might be portrayed. He understood that producers did not manufacture arguments, but he observed that the young players had internalized the idea that everything could become part of a narrative. He said that the psychological effect of knowing a producer was watching, always assessing, subtly influenced behavior, creating a constant, invisible pressure that filtered authenticity. Producers did not have to manipulate directly to shape perception. Editing alone provided control over narrative. A 10-second exchange, captured in isolation, could be reframed to suggest tension, mistrust, or conflict that never truly existed. One running back recounted a situation where a casual conversation about game preparation was presented in the episode as an argument about commitment. He explained that the misrepresentation caused confusion among teammates and led to discussions he had never anticipated. The producer, in shaping the storyline, was indirectly influencing relationships and the perception of team cohesion. The subtle manipulation extended to tone, emphasis, and context. Producers selected which emotional beats were highlighted and which were downplayed. An apology could be omitted. A moment of laughter could be minimized. A comment meant in jest could be framed as hostile. The careful crafting of these moments created a tension between the lived experience of the players and the narrative presented to the audience. Players began to realize that the story being told was not necessarily their story, and that their behavior in the locker room had to be balanced between authenticity and how they would be represented to millions. Producers often built storylines around archetypes. There was the veteran who embodied wisdom and leadership, the rookie who symbolized ambition and uncertainty, the emotionally expressive player who could carry a narrative arc, and the silent stoic figure whose quiet demeanor became mysterious or brooding in the edit. These archetypes simplified the complexity of human behavior, but they created a framework that guided interactions. Players felt the invisible suggestion to perform within certain roles. The line between self and character began to blur. One young quarterback remarked that he sometimes wondered if he was speaking for himself or if he had become the character the producer wanted the audience to see. That duality created cognitive and emotional stress that extended beyond the field and into everyday life. Producers also understood timing. They knew when the emotional stakes were highest and positioned themselves to capture those moments. One offensive lineman explained that the day of a critical roster cut felt different because he could sense the producer observing with intent. Even simple expressions of frustration or disappointment were magnified by the presence of a storyteller seeking narrative arcs. The lineman said that he felt the pressure to remain composed, but he also felt the unspoken expectation that emotional truthfulness would enhance the story. This tension created a delicate balance between personal authenticity and narrative utility. The influence of producers reached into areas beyond emotion. They sometimes guided interviews or one-on-one conversations in ways that affected how events were later interpreted. A defensive back described being asked to discuss his relationships with teammates on camera. He said the producer prompted him to expand on conflicts that were minor in reality but could be emphasized for dramatic effect, while the producer framed the request as curiosity or interest. The defensive back quickly recognized that this guidance shaped the narrative arc of the episode. What had been private reflection became a performative act, intended to fulfill the structural needs of storytelling rather than the player's own emotional process. This dynamic created a unique hierarchy within the locker room. Players learned that influence no longer resided solely with coaches, captains, or organizational executives. Producers, through the power of editing and narrative shaping, wielded a different kind of authority. Their presence was silent but omnipresent, affecting strategy, emotional expression, and personal interactions. In some cases, players adapted by becoming more deliberate in their communications, weighing each sentence and gesture for its potential impact on narrative. Others responded with subtle resistance, maintaining their natural rhythms while attempting to shield certain behaviors from the lens. Both approaches reflected the complex negotiation between human authenticity and media construction. There were moments when players and producers aligned naturally. When emotional truth matched narrative need, the results could be compelling and even therapeutic. A running back recalled sharing a story about his father's illness and how it influenced his career. The producer encouraged him to reflect on the emotional core, and the player later said that telling the story in that structured context helped him process his own feelings. These positive interactions existed, but they were exceptions. Most often, the tension came from the ongoing awareness that every action and word might be reframed, amplified, or misinterpreted. The presence of the producer, even with the best intentions, created a layer of constant evaluation that altered the natural flow of locker room culture. Producers also influenced the broader perception of organizational culture. When they highlighted conflict, humor, resilience, or vulnerability, the audience developed an understanding of the team that was filtered through the narrative choices of a few unseen hands. Coaches and executives realized that public perception could affect morale, fan engagement, and organizational reputation. Players understood that being a part of the narrative came with stakes beyond individual performance. The locker room became not only a site of athletic preparation, but also a site of cultural production, where stories were crafted and reputations were shaped. The psychological and emotional consequences of this influence were profound. Players reported increased self-monitoring, heightened awareness of relational dynamics, and a constant sense of performativity. The very fabric of interpersonal trust, long held as foundational to team cohesion, faced new pressures. Even moments that were once private or fleeting were now potential episodes with long-term implications. Players described feeling the invisible gaze of producers shaping their decisions, their words, and their emotional expression in subtle but lasting ways. Understanding the role of the producer in the locker room is essential to understanding the transformation of football culture in the age of media exposure. It reveals how storytelling, while compelling for audiences, introduced unseen pressures that affected behavior, relationships, and performance. The presence of the producer blurred the line between documentation and manipulation, observation and influence, reality and narrative construction. The locker room was no longer merely a space for preparation and camaraderie. It became a stage where human behavior was reframed and replayed, where emotional authenticity had to coexist with narrative expectation, and where unseen hands quietly reshaped the experience of the sport. This chapter sets the stage for the next phase of the documentary, where the influence of cameras and producers begins to interact with competition itself. The emotional and relational pressures of media exposure intersect with the intensity of play on the field, creating consequences that ripple through every aspect of team dynamics. In the world of modern football storytelling, most players understood the unspoken contract. They knew that cameras followed them, that their actions would be edited, and that moments would be shaped into narrative arcs beyond their control. Most adapted, some reluctantly, others with surprising fluency, but a few resisted. One of these players became emblematic of the tension between authenticity and narrative construction. His story illuminates the cost of refusing to be molded into a character for the audience's consumption and the emotional toll of standing against the machinery of media influence. The player entered the league with exceptional talent and a reputation for being intensely private. He had grown up believing that football required complete focus and discipline, and he valued authenticity above all else. In his rookie year, he noticed immediately that the presence of cameras created behavioral pressure. His teammates performed for the lens, subtly adjusting their personalities to fit anticipated storylines. He resisted. He refused to exaggerate emotion, to play into expected archetypes, or to frame his experiences for the benefit of the audience. From his perspective, football was a craft, a competition, a profession. He had no interest in being a character in a story constructed by producers and editors. This resistance was not without consequence. Coaches accustomed to using media narratives as tools to engage fans and maintain team culture initially struggled to understand him. They appreciated his talent, but they worried that his refusal to participate in narrative shaping created a void in the storytelling arc that others filled. Producers tried to encourage him, offering opportunities for interviews, inviting him to expand on personal stories, and framing these suggestions as a chance to share his perspective. Each time, he declined, politely but firmly. He would answer questions succinctly, never elaborating, never dramatizing, never offering material that could be reframed. His reluctance was perceived by some as standoffishness, even arrogance, though in truth it was a deliberate choice to preserve personal integrity. The tension escalated during a pivotal season in which his team agreed to a highly publicized documentary series. Other players adapted readily, knowing that participation could increase visibility, fan recognition, and even endorsement potential. He continued to resist. Producers began to notice the absence of his voice. Episodes captured teammates' reactions, but his own perspective was often reduced to brief snippets or absent entirely. While other players' narratives unfolded in arcs of triumph, conflict, or growth, his story remained static. His refusal to perform introduced gaps, inconsistencies, and narrative tension that could not be smoothed over by editing. For the production team, he became the outlier, the silent figure whose presence defied categorization. The emotional cost of this resistance was significant. Teammates sometimes interpreted his behavior as cold or disengaged. Coaches occasionally expressed frustration, believing that his lack of participation disrupted team cohesion or undercut opportunities for leadership visibility. Media attention often fixated on the contrast between his detachment and the narrative-driven engagement of others. He became a subject of speculation, both within the locker room and among fans. People questioned his motives, questioned his personality, and questioned his commitment to the team, despite the fact that his performance on the field remained exemplary. Players described a subtle but constant social pressure. Teammates who embraced the cameras would comment casually about episodes, share insights from production meetings, or make jokes about the way moments were edited. He declined to participate in these conversations. As a result, he often felt isolated, excluded from social dynamics that were amplified by the presence of media. The very act of refusing to perform created a new layer of scrutiny. Not of skill or work ethic, but of personality and perceived attitude. He became aware that narrative control was now part of the invisible rules of engagement, and his known compliance carried consequences for how others perceived him. Despite these pressures, he maintained his stance. He explained that performing for the cameras compromised authenticity. He did not want moments of real vulnerability, disagreement, or emotion reframed as entertainment. He did not want his personal story reduced to a simplified character arc. He valued the integrity of his relationships with teammates, coaches, and family more than public approval or screen time. His decision reflected a broader philosophy that the human experience of football, its struggles, sacrifices, and triumphs, was too complex to be distilled into a narrative designed for consumption. For him, participation in story shaping was a betrayal of that philosophy. The consequences extended to public perception. Fans accustomed to character-driven storytelling found it difficult to connect with him. While other players became popular for their drama, charisma, or emotional openness, he remained enigmatic. Interviews with media often highlighted his brevity and minimal engagement. Critics framed him as reserved or aloof, yet this public interpretation was inaccurate. His quietness was deliberate, reflective, and principled. He understood that media exposure could never fully capture the internal reality of being an NFL player, and he resisted reducing his experience to spectacle. One of the most significant moments in his career occurred during a controversial game in which teammates became emotionally charged on camera. Producers highlighted the tension, framing several players' reactions as pivotal narrative beats. He remained composed, focused solely on performance. Coaches later acknowledged that his ability to detach from the media lens allowed him to maintain clarity under pressure. While the spotlight created additional distractions for others, he preserved the focus that made him an effective player. Yet even this professional advantage was overshadowed in public perception by his refusal to participate in the drama. He learned that integrity often came with a social and emotional cost. The internal experience of resisting narrative shaping was intense. He described moments of loneliness, frustration, and moral contemplation. He recognized that by standing apart from the constructed storylines, he risked alienation from teammates, coaches, and even fans. He experienced anxiety regarding the potential for misinterpretation, knowing that producers could frame silence or brevity as disinterest, conflict, or weakness. Yet he also described a profound sense of autonomy. By refusing to be molded into a character, he maintained ownership of his identity, preserving boundaries between personal truth and public narrative. This autonomy became a defining feature of his professional and emotional life. The fallout extended beyond the individual to influence organizational culture. Some executives worried that his behavior might inspire similar resistance, potentially complicating media agreements and content production. Others admired his stance as a demonstration of principled professionalism. Coaches learned to navigate the challenge of balancing team participation with individual autonomy. His example underscored the reality that media presence was no longer a neutral element. It had become a force capable of shaping relationships, perceptions, and culture. This case highlights the tension at the heart of modern football media. The desire to document reality colliding with the human need for privacy, authenticity, and agency. The player's resistance was not a rejection of storytelling itself, but a reclamation of personal narrative. It demonstrated the emotional complexity of existing in an environment where visibility is both opportunity and pressure. While many players adapted to narrative demands, his stance serves as a reminder that authenticity comes with emotional and social costs, and that the human experience of sport cannot be fully captured or simplified for entertainment. The story of the player who refused to be a character also foreshadows the growing intersection between personal autonomy, media influence, and mental health. It illustrates how narrative expectations, when imposed externally, affect not only public perception, but the internal experience of athletes. Players in similar positions faced the same pressures: the subtle manipulation of behavior, the social consequences of resistance. and the emotional labor required to navigate a world where every interaction could be repurposed for audience engagement. In the broader context of the documentary, this case exemplifies the psychological and emotional stakes of modern media exposure. It demonstrates that resisting external control is possible, but not without consequence. It challenges the assumption that players are passive participants in their own storylines. It illuminates the complexities of integrity, autonomy, and identity in the NFL's evolving landscape, where personal truth often collides with the demands of narrative construction. The experience of this player prepares the stage for exploring how these dynamics influence not just individuals, but entire teams and communities within the league. The next chapter examines the pressures of collective identity, where group behavior and shared narratives intersect with media presence, competition, and the emotional realities of professional football. In the high-stakes world of professional football, team culture has always been an intangible yet decisive force. It is cultivated through years of shared experience, trust, and unspoken understanding. The locker room operates as both sanctuary and crucible, where bonds are tested, rivalries contained, and unity forged. But there was one season, emblematic of the pressures that modern media introduced, where the carefully balanced ecosystem of trust and respect began to unravel. That season has come to be known, quietly among insiders, as the year the locker room broke. It was a stark reminder of how visibility, narrative construction, and media exposure could disrupt cohesion, erode trust, and fundamentally alter the psychology of a team. The team entered the season with strong expectations. Veteran leaders had established a culture of accountability, professionalism, and mutual support. Younger players were expected to learn, contribute, and respect the hierarchy that had historically sustained success. On the surface, nothing appeared unusual. Practices were intense, playbooks were executed with precision, and preseason predictions placed the team among contenders. Yet beneath this veneer, the introduction of pervasive media exposure began to erode the traditional social architecture of the locker room. It began subtly. Cameras were present for interviews, training sessions, and locker room access that extended beyond the norm. Producers were encouraged to capture authentic interactions, capturing emotions that were once private. At first, players adjusted cautiously, performing small gestures of compliance, smiling for the lens, and answering questions with care. The younger players were especially attentive, observing the expectations for narrative participation and aligning themselves accordingly. The veteran leaders tried to maintain equilibrium, modeling behavior while emphasizing that football was the priority. But the balance was fragile. Tension emerged as producers sought dramatic moments, highlighting disagreements and amplifying minor incidents. A miscommunication between a wide receiver and a quarterback during practice was edited to emphasize frustration and conflict. Clips of brief arguments over play execution were positioned in a sequence that suggested ongoing tension, creating the perception of dysfunction. Players noticed the reframing and began to question one another. Conversations that once would have been resolved privately became loaded with the awareness of potential broadcast. Every word and gesture carried amplified weight. Trust, which had been a core pillar of team culture, started to fray. The social dynamics of the locker room shifted. Players began to blame one another for moments that were disproportionately highlighted on camera. Frustration mounted as the sense of fairness eroded. Veteran players observed that younger teammates were increasingly cautious, wary of missteps that could be amplified for entertainment. Simultaneously, younger players began to resent the presence of production, fearing that mistakes would define their public image. Misunderstandings multiplied, and a culture of suspicion gradually replaced the established atmosphere of mutual accountability. Coaches struggled to maintain authority and cohesion. They recognized the potential impact of media-driven tension, but had limited ability to intervene without appearing to control or manipulate the narrative themselves. Discipline that would once have been handled privately now risked public interpretation. The interplay between team management, coaching, and production created an environment where every decision had dual consequences, one on the field, one in the lens. This duality heightened stress and created uncertainty about how interactions would be perceived internally and externally. The fractures were not abstract. They manifested in measurable performance. Communication on the field faltered. Plays that required split-second trust and coordination occasionally broke down. Players hesitated to speak openly about mistakes, fearing that their words would be reframed. Practices, once spaces of candid discussion and problem-solving, became cautious exercises in controlled expression. The psychological burden of constant scrutiny translated into errors, miscalculations, and growing frustration. Analysts reviewing the season noted inconsistencies and drops in execution that aligned with periods of heightened media coverage, though the connections were rarely made explicit in public reporting. By mid-season, the locker room atmosphere had become visibly strained. Leaders noticed subtle shifts in loyalty as players aligned themselves according to perceived narrative favor rather than team strategy. Cliques formed around media presence, with some individuals emerging as central figures in the constructed storylines. Others, unwilling to perform for the lens, became marginalized. The social architecture that had sustained cohesion for years was eroded by the invisible influence of production and exposure. Players experienced the dual burden of performing professionally and managing the implications of narrative framing. The psychological impact was profound. Anxiety levels rose. Players described a heightened sense of vigilance, monitoring not only the actions of teammates, but also the subtle cues that might attract media attention. Depression and frustration emerged in discussions behind closed doors, as the emotional labor of balancing performance, interpersonal trust, and narrative awareness weighed heavily. One linebacker described feeling exhausted not from the physicality of the sport, but from the constant mental effort required to navigate the combined pressures of practice, performance, and perception. The season became a case study in how media presence can amplify human vulnerability and stress. The consequences extended beyond interpersonal dynamics. Team rituals, once vital for unity, began to lose meaning. Celebrations, jokes, and informal mentoring were observed with an awareness of visibility. Moments of genuine connection became inflected with self-consciousness, reducing spontaneity. Veteran players lamented that humor was measured, camaraderie calculated, and interactions scripted in subtle ways that preserved appearances. Even moments of vulnerability were subject to reflection and caution, creating a cultural shift that emphasized performative cohesion over organic trust. The breaking of the locker room was not a sudden collapse, but an accumulation of pressure, exposure, and emotional labor. The constant awareness of audience perception reshaped social hierarchies and communication patterns. Players became wary of misinterpretation, sensitive to framing, and cautious in their expressions of trust. Traditional markers of leadership, such as mentorship and candid feedback, became complicated by the dual lens of performance and perception. The psychological costs, though largely invisible to fans, were real and measurable in interactions, performance, and emotional well-being. At the end of the season, reflection revealed the depth of the fracture. Players, coaches, and staff recognized that the culture they had relied upon for years had been destabilized by the intersection of media exposure and human psychology. While the public might have celebrated drama and narrative engagement, inside the locker room there was a profound sense of loss. Trust, once implicit and automatic, had to be rebuilt. Relationships had been tested in ways that no playbook or coaching strategy could have predicted. The season served as a warning that the integration of media into the core of football culture could carry consequences beyond storytelling, affecting cohesion, identity, and emotional resilience. The year the locker room broke became a cautionary tale within the league. Other teams studied the season, noting the interplay between media exposure and internal culture. Executives and coaches debated protocols for managing cameras, balancing storytelling with the psychological needs of athletes. Players reflected on how narrative pressures influence behavior and trust. and some began seeking strategies to navigate visibility without compromising authenticity. The episode highlighted the need for awareness, negotiation, and emotional intelligence in the modern era of football storytelling. This season also illustrated the human cost of entertainment. While viewers engaged with episodes for drama, fans rarely considered the impact on interpersonal trust, team strategy, or mental health. The story of the broken locker room demonstrates that the cost of exposure is borne not by abstract entities, but by real people, navigating complex social and emotional landscapes under the dual pressure of athletic performance and mediated narrative. It serves as a powerful reminder that the intersection of reality, perception, and storytelling carries consequences far beyond the field. The lessons of that season extend to broader questions about professional sports culture, the ethics of media integration, and the psychological resilience required of players. They underscore the reality that visibility is both a tool and a stressor, shaping behavior, relationships, and emotional experience. The year the locker room broke is a testament to the fragility of human trust in the presence of constructed narratives and the enduring challenge of preserving authenticity within a mediated world. Professional football has always been more than just a game. Behind the roar of the crowd, behind the strategic brilliance on the field, there exists an entire financial ecosystem that sustains the sport. Television contracts, sponsorships, ticket sales, merchandising, and digital platforms generate billions annually, creating incentives that extend far beyond athletic performance. In the modern era, the convergence of football and media has intensified, and the rise of reality-style content has transformed the economics of the game. The locker room, once a private domain for strategy and trust, has become a highly monetized stage. Decisions once driven purely by football value now intersect with entertainment potential and financial considerations, creating a tension that fundamentally reshapes the league. The integration of media into team operations began subtly, often framed as an opportunity to engage fans and expand the sport's reach. Shows documenting preseason practices, behind-the-scenes footage, and team-controlled documentaries were marketed as authentic access to the inner workings of professional football. Yet beneath the surface, a different calculus began to emerge. Teams quickly recognized that certain players, moments, and interactions generated higher audience engagement. Producers and executives noted which storylines attracted viewers and which personalities drove social media conversation. The economics of exposure became intertwined with decision-making at multiple levels. From roster management to coaching strategies and promotional campaigns, one immediate consequence was the prioritization of entertainment value over football value. Players whose personalities translated well to the screen gained visibility, fan support, and sometimes preferential treatment in narrative-driven content. A charismatic wide receiver, for example, might be highlighted for interactions that were inconsequential to game outcomes, but compelling to audiences. Conversely, a player whose contributions were vital to the team's success, but who lacked screen presence, could be marginalized in the narrative. While these dynamics did not always influence coaching decisions directly, they affected public perception, endorsements, and organizational priorities, subtly incentivizing media performance alongside athletic skill. The financial incentives became clear as producers and networks invested in multi-season contracts for access. Teams recognized that participation in documentaries could attract sponsorship deals, increase merchandise sales, and expand media rights revenue. The appeal of monetizing the locker room and practice facility became a powerful motivator. Executive leadership began to consider exposure as part of overall team strategy, balancing competitive priorities with opportunities for financial growth. In some cases, a player's perceived on-camera charisma influenced how frequently they were showcased or integrated into promotional content. The lines between football strategy and marketing strategy grew increasingly blurred. Players quickly became aware of these pressures. Younger athletes, in particular, recognized that being memorable on camera could elevate their profile and create opportunities beyond the field. Interviews and narrative arcs offered a platform for brand building, personal storytelling, and potential endorsement deals. For some, this presented an additional layer of career strategy to excel not only as athletes, but also as personalities. Yet this visibility came with unintended consequences. Performance anxiety, social tension, and self-conscious behavior emerged as players navigated the dual demands of athletic excellence and public persona. The very act of existing on screen became a source of stress and influence. Veterans were often more resistant, prioritizing the integrity of the game over media performance. Yet even for them, the financial realities could not be ignored. Teams increasingly used narrative exposure as leverage in contract negotiations, promotions, and public-facing initiatives. Media-savvy players found that visibility could translate into longer contracts, higher pay, and enhanced marketability. Less visible players risked diminished public recognition, which could indirectly influence opportunities both within and beyond football. The economics of exposure had created a parallel valuation system in which narrative presence and entertainment potential were assets in addition to athletic skill. The intersection of economics and media also altered organizational decision-making. Coaches and executives began to weigh the potential for compelling footage alongside traditional performance metrics. Lineups, playing time, and strategic decisions occasionally became intertwined with the desire to highlight particular personalities or dramatize key moments. While performance remained central to success, the added layer of media-driven calculation introduced an unprecedented variable into team operations. The locker room became a dual ecosystem of athletic execution and narrative orchestration, and players had to navigate both simultaneously. This economic pressure amplified the social and emotional consequences of visibility. Players aware of their marketable presence sometimes wielded influence in subtle ways, consciously or unconsciously aligning behavior with producers' expectations. Rivalries could intensify as athletes competed for narrative attention. Leaders in the locker room had to negotiate interpersonal dynamics under the scrutiny of both colleagues and the audience. Even camaraderie could be affected as players balanced authenticity with the perceived need to perform for the camera. The financial stakes heightened the psychological burden, reinforcing the notion that exposure carried tangible material consequences in addition to reputational and emotional impact. The effects were not confined to individuals. Entire teams began to experience the consequences of media-driven economics. Culture and cohesion could be disrupted as players' behavior was influenced by perceived visibility. Those willing to embrace the narrative gained advantages in attention and opportunities, while those less interested in performing risked marginalization. Organizational policies evolved to integrate media management into operational strategy, from communication training to approved social media interactions. The economics of exposure became an integral consideration at every level of team functioning, from player onboarding to senior leadership decisions. Even the perception of value changed in the public sphere. Fans and media outlets often celebrated players who created compelling storylines, sometimes at the expense of recognizing purely athletic contributions. Statistical excellence could be overshadowed by personality-driven narratives. Analysts, commentators, and social media influencers frequently highlighted dramatic or visually engaging moments over technical mastery. In this environment, players internalized the dual imperative to excel both as athletes and as participants in an ongoing, mediated narrative. The interplay of economics, perception, and performance became a defining feature of the modern league. Mental health consequences mirrored these pressures. Anxiety, stress, and self-consciousness arose not only from performance on the field, but from the constant evaluation of how one would appear in episodes, interviews, or promotional segments. Players reported feeling the burden of being assessed by invisible producers, audience expectations, and internalized comparisons to more media-friendly teammates. The economic incentives of visibility amplified these effects, reinforcing the need to navigate the complexities of performance, narrative, and perception. The modern locker room had become a psychological arena in which athletic skill, social navigation, and media literacy were all essential for survival. The economic calculus also reshaped career trajectories. Players who excelled in narrative presence found increased opportunities for endorsements, branding, and post-career ventures. Those who resisted or lacked media-friendly charisma sometimes faced limited visibility, which could affect public recognition and marketability. In this environment, talent alone was insufficient. Understanding and engaging with the economics of exposure became a crucial aspect of professional strategy. This evolution reflected a broader transformation in professional sports, where financial and narrative considerations intersected with performance in unprecedented ways. The year of heightened media integration serves as a case study in the consequences of monetizing exposure. Teams, players, and executives had to navigate complex, ethical, emotional, and strategic decisions. The pursuit of entertainment value, while profitable, introduced tension, inequity, and stress within organizations. Trust, camaraderie, and focus, so essential for competitive success, were challenged by the simultaneous imperatives of athletic excellence and narrative engagement. The economics of exposure had transformed the NFL from a purely competitive arena into a media-driven ecosystem, where visibility itself carried measurable consequences. This analysis underscores the broader theme of the documentary, that the merger of football and media has reshaped not only perception, but reality. Financial incentives, audience engagement, and narrative construction influence behavior, relationships, and decision-making at every level. Players, coaches, and executives must navigate a world in which exposure generates tangible economic benefits, but also emotional and social costs. The economics of exposure is a lens through which to understand the profound changes in the culture, psychology, and operations of modern football. As the season concluded and audiences engaged with the stories unfolding on screen, the lessons were unmistakable. Money, visibility, and narrative influence were intertwined in ways that complicated traditional notions of athletic performance and leadership. Teams and players had to adapt, negotiate, and sometimes resist these pressures to maintain both integrity and competitiveness. The impact of media-driven economics is ongoing, shaping every aspect of the sport from individual behavior to organizational strategy. And it lays the groundwork for understanding the final phases of the locker room's transformation. The next chapter examines the personal cost of these pressures on players as they reconcile public expectation with private reality. The consequences of exposure are not only systemic, but intimate, affecting identity, relationships, and the emotional landscape of those who inhabit the game's most visible and vulnerable spaces. Professional football has always existed within a framework of fan engagement, a dynamic that blends passion, expectation, and emotional investment. Historically, fans experienced the game through stadium attendance, broadcasts, and journalistic reporting. Their connection to players was mediated, distant, and respectful of the boundaries between public performance and private life. Yet, with the rise of reality-style content, team-controlled documentaries, and behind-the-scenes coverage, a new type of fan interaction emerged, reshaping the psychological landscape for athletes. Audiences began forming what social psychologists call parasocial relationships, one-sided emotional connections where the viewer feels intimately involved in the life of a player, while the athlete remains largely unaware of the personal attachment being formed. This phenomenon introduced a subtle but pervasive pressure, creating emotional weight that few players had anticipated. The parasocial bond begins innocuously. Fans watch interviews, locker room interactions, and casual moments with the illusion of intimacy. They laugh at jokes, celebrate personal milestones, and feel they know the players on a human level. The production techniques of reality-style football documentaries deliberately amplify this effect, capturing unguarded expressions, personal commentary, and relational dynamics that were once invisible to the public. A wide receiver's quiet frustration over a dropped pass, A linebacker's protective encouragement of a rookie or a quarterback's private reflection after a loss each moment can be reframed to create emotional resonance for viewers. For the audience, these glimpses foster a sense of emotional ownership. They do not simply support the team. They feel personally involved in the lives of the athletes. The psychological consequences for players, however, are profound. Athletes are acutely aware that their actions are being observed, analyzed, often judged by a global audience that feels entitled to their private emotional world. The distinction between professional performance and personal identity becomes blurred. Decisions that once might have been made purely on the basis of strategy, personal values, or team dynamics are now filtered through the awareness of public perception. A comment made in confidence, a gesture in frustration, or a private moment of vulnerability can suddenly be interpreted as evidence of character, personality, or narrative trajectory. The weight of imagined scrutiny is relentless. For younger players, the burden is particularly heavy. They enter the league with high hopes, raw talent, and ambition, but they also inherit the complex dynamics of media-driven expectation. Reality-style coverage encourages visibility and dramatization. Fans form intense attachments quickly, celebrating emerging stars while scrutinizing perceived missteps. Players report feeling a dual identity: the athlete who trains, practices, and competes, and the persona constructed by the editing, narrative, and public engagement. Navigating this duality can produce anxiety, self-consciousness, and a pervasive sense of obligation. They must perform not only for the coaches and teammates, but also for an invisible audience whose emotional investment is relentless and often unacknowledged. Veteran players are not immune. While experienced athletes may have developed coping mechanisms and a thicker skin, the relentless gaze of parasocial interaction creates a subtle pressure that is difficult to ignore. Social media platforms amplify exposure, connecting fans to moments that would otherwise remain private. Positive engagement can reinforce the perception of accountability, but negative commentary, critique, or perceived betrayal of expectations can erode confidence and strain focus. Players who were once able to compartmentalize professional and personal spheres now confront the psychological reality that every action carries both immediate and mediated consequences. The consequences extend beyond individual performance. Team culture is affected when athletes internalize the pressures of parasocial bonds. Some players prioritize behaviors that they believe will resonate with the audience, consciously or unconsciously, adjusting interactions to align with perceived fan expectations. This recalibration can affect honesty, spontaneity, and authenticity within the locker room. Decisions about communication, mentorship, and conflict resolution are influenced by awareness of external observation, creating tension and subtle behavioral shifts. The parasocial dynamic operates as an invisible force shaping interactions, trust, and the psychological ecosystem of the team. This phenomenon also introduces ethical considerations. Fans, in forming parasocial attachments, develop expectations that are impossible to meet. They may feel entitled to emotional transparency, access to personal struggles, or insight into private moments. The athletes, in turn, are compelled to navigate these expectations without explicit consent, often balancing authenticity against the pressure to perform emotionally. The result is a complex moral landscape in which players are simultaneously human beings, entertainers, and objects of emotional investment. The strain of this triad is both subtle and cumulative. The interplay of parasocial relationships and media production is especially evident in narrative editing. Selective focus, sequencing, and juxtaposition of moments can craft dramatic arcs that amplify fan investment. A heated exchange in the locker room may be framed as a major rivalry. A personal setback may be magnified to inspire empathy, and moments of camaraderie may be idealized to reinforce the emotional connection. Players experience the consequences of these editorial decisions, indirectly, through the intensity of audience response. What might have been a single fleeting moment now carries the weight of global perception, transforming ordinary interactions into high-stakes psychological events. The pressure extends to private life as well, with fan interest extending beyond the field. Players report experiencing unsolicited commentary, judgment, and advice regarding personal choices. Relationships, family interactions, and lifestyle decisions can be scrutinized, whether on social media, fan forums, or in direct communication. Athletes confront a unique form of exposure that blurs the boundary between professional responsibility and personal autonomy. Decisions that would once have been purely private become publicly consequential, creating a pervasive sense of responsibility to manage perception alongside performance. Mental health outcomes reflect the gravity of this new dynamic. Anxiety, stress, and emotional fatigue often stem not from performance deficits on the field, but from the unrelenting awareness of audience attention. Players describe a sense of being observed continuously, not only by coaches and teammates, but by fans who feel entitled to intimate knowledge of their lives. Depression, self-doubt, and social withdrawal are reported in interviews with athletes navigating the tension between personal authenticity and mediated persona. The parasocial bond, while fostering admiration and engagement, introduces a powerful psychological burden that is difficult to mitigate. Coaches and team staff attempt to support players, offering guidance on media management, mental health resources, and personal boundaries. Yet the nature of parasocial attachment means that the pressure exists largely outside organizational control. Audience investment is decentralized, amplified by social platforms, and impervious to traditional team structures. Athletes must develop individual resilience strategies, often relying on trusted mentors, mental health professionals, or internal coping mechanisms. The intersection of parasocial influence and professional responsibility creates an unprecedented challenge for psychological preparation and emotional management. In some cases, players have attempted to reclaim agency by controlling the narrative directly. Social media posts, interviews, and public statements are used to communicate personal context, clarify misperceptions, or establish identity. These efforts reflect the necessity of navigating parasocial relationships strategically, balancing transparency against the risk of overexposure. Yet even carefully managed efforts cannot fully mitigate the psychological pressure, as fans continue to interpret, speculate, and invest emotionally. The dynamic is inherently asymmetrical, favoring audience perception over player control. The emergence of parasocial pressure also illustrates broader societal shifts in how entertainment, sports, and media consumption intersect. Fans expect access, authenticity, and intimacy. Athletes are cast as both performers and people, subject to constant evaluation. The economic incentives for producing and disseminating such content ensure that parasocial dynamics are not only inevitable, but amplified by design. Viewership metrics, advertising revenue, and engagement analytics reward emotionally resonant storytelling, incentivizing content that exposes personal dynamics and heightens emotional attachment. Players, therefore, navigate a landscape in which personal vulnerability is monetized, observed, and emotionally co-opted by a distant audience. The consequences are cumulative. Across a season, players internalize the pressure of visibility, exposure, and audience expectation. Relationships within the locker room are reframed through the lens of public perception. Decisions about behavior, communication, and performance are informed not only by team objectives, but by an awareness of how every moment may be perceived externally. The parasocial bond, while invisible to the naked eye, becomes a constant, shaping the emotional and psychological experience of professional athletes. By the end of the season, the cumulative effects of parasocial pressure are unmistakable. Players articulate fatigue, heightened self-awareness, and tension that extends beyond the field. Coaches and executives recognize that performance is influenced not only by skill and preparation, but by the psychological burden imposed by audience engagement. The year illustrates that in the modern era, the relationship between fans and athletes extends far beyond admiration. It is a force that shapes identity, behavior, and emotional resilience in profound and often underappreciated ways. The phenomenon of parasocial attachment illuminates the final stages of the locker room transformation. Visibility, narrative construction, and audience investment now intersect with psychology, performance, and culture in unprecedented ways. The weight of external expectation, combined with the financial and media pressures already documented, creates a comprehensive portrait of the modern athlete's experience. Understanding this dimension is essential for a full account of the human cost of football's convergence with entertainment and reality-style storytelling. The next and final batch will synthesize these systemic pressures, examining their cumulative impact on careers, identities, and the enduring culture of professional football. It will reflect on lessons learned, ethical considerations, and the enduring human consequences of life under constant observation. The cameras capture the moments that entertain, that thrill, that engage audiences. They capture the touchdowns, the interceptions, the celebrations, and the confrontations. They capture the personalities that make viewers care. But what they never show is the silent weight carried behind the lens. The locker room becomes a stage, but it is also a crucible. Every player who steps into it is exposed not only to scrutiny and expectation, but also to the emotional and psychological toll of constant observation. In the glare of production lights and the promise of audience engagement, the private humanity of these athletes often disappears. The footage edited for drama obscures the nuance, the quiet suffering, and the complex reality of what it means to exist simultaneously as a competitor and as a character. Players reported dissonance between their lived experience and the narrative presented to the audience. Moments of exhaustion, frustration, or doubt are compressed, reframed, or omitted entirely. The edits favor conflict, clarity, and coherence over authenticity, leaving little room for the ambiguity that defines human emotion. The laughter shared among teammates in a tense week, the quiet reflection after a mistake, the personal struggle with injury or fatigue of these realities are often lost to storytelling imperatives. The player who appears confident and composed on screen may have spent hours in solitude, grappling with doubt, anxiety, or despair. The emotional labor required to maintain a performative persona, in addition to the physical demands of professional football, is immense. Mental health concerns have emerged as a critical consequence of this constant visibility. Anxiety, depression, and stress manifest in ways that are both predictable and insidious. Players describe the sensation of being perpetually monitored, of knowing that even the smallest gesture can be observed, judged, and interpreted. The knowledge that every action may become content adds a layer of psychological pressure that is difficult to escape. Injuries, personal struggles, and moments of vulnerability are not only physical or emotional experiences, but also potential narrative points, which introduces a duality that can undermine mental well-being. The cumulative effect is a unique form of fatigue that extends beyond physical conditioning. It is mental, emotional, and social, a constant negotiation of self under observation. Trust, once a cornerstone of locker room culture, is also affected. The presence of cameras and producers introduces a dynamic in which teammates may become wary of full honesty. Conversations that were once private are now filtered through the lens of potential exposure. Players may withhold feelings, downplay conflicts, or alter their behavior to avoid being framed negatively. Leadership structures are complicated as veteran guidance is reframed through audience perception. Coaching, mentoring, and peer support are all impacted by the awareness that private interactions could become public content. Trust is not destroyed outright, but it is strained, reshaped, and constantly evaluated. Identity itself becomes a fluid construct under the weight of production. Players navigate multiple selves, the athlete performing in games, the persona edited for television, and the private individual experiencing the pressures of career, family, and personal growth. The disparity between these identities can produce confusion, self-doubt, and a sense of dislocation. A rookie thrust into the spotlight may struggle to reconcile admiration with anxiety, visibility with vulnerability. A veteran may wrestle with maintaining authenticity while satisfying both team expectations and audience engagement. The emotional cost of managing multiple identities over the course of a demanding season is rarely visible to the viewers who consume the highlight reels and storylines without knowing the labor behind them. Cameras also alter the perception of failure. Mistakes, setbacks, and emotional reactions are magnified when mediated through editing. A misstep in practice, a frustrated gesture during a timeout, or an expression of fatigue may be highlighted for drama, contributing to a distorted sense of accountability and judgment. Players internalize these portrayals, feeling the weight of public scrutiny on top of professional responsibility. The emotional labor required to manage perception becomes as significant as the labor required to execute plays on the field. Over time, this dual burden can erode confidence, strain relationships, and alter the fundamental experience of being a professional athlete. The consequences extend beyond individual players to the team as a whole. Locker room dynamics, camaraderie, and cohesion are affected by the awareness that every interaction might be observed or repurposed for entertainment. Rivalries may intensify, alliances may shift, and communication may be filtered through the lens of potential exposure. While teams continue to perform on the field, the internal social environment is transformed, with players negotiating not only competitive challenges, but also the invisible pressures of narrative scrutiny. The private culture of professional football is reshaped, sometimes imperceptibly, by forces outside traditional coaching, strategy, and athletic performance. Families also bear the impact of this exposure. Partners, children, and extended relatives may find themselves indirectly incorporated into the public narrative. Emotional labor is not confined to the players alone. Spouses and children experience scrutiny, commentary, and the burden of representing the family unit under observation. The personal consequences ripple outward, reminding us that the cost of exposure is not isolated to those in uniform, but extends to the support systems that sustain them. The emotional terrain of professional football becomes a shared responsibility, complicated by the demands of visibility and public expectation. Economic incentives magnify these pressures. Teams and networks profit from exposure and engagement, reinforcing the incentive to maintain narrative arcs that highlight personal and interpersonal dynamics. Players are aware that their stories, both authentic and mediated, generate revenue, fan attention, and marketability. The resulting tension is ethical as well as emotional. Athletes must navigate the demands of production without compromising personal integrity, while producers balance financial interests with the well-being of participants. The invisible ledger of emotional cost is rarely reconciled in this system, and the human consequences are often delayed or obscured. The cumulative effect is a modern reality in which professional athletes exist in multiple spheres simultaneously. They compete, perform, narrate, and negotiate identity under constant observation. The public perceives only a fraction of the total experience, curated through editing, storytelling, and selective framing. The private labor, the emotional exhaustion, and the subtle erosion of trust and identity remain largely unseen. What the cameras never showed is a rich landscape of human experience, fraught with complexity, vulnerability, and consequence. Understanding this hidden dimension is critical to appreciating the full scope of professional football today. These pressures illuminate a broader truth about the intersection of sport, media, and culture. Entertainment and athleticism have become inseparable in modern professional football. Financial incentives, audience engagement, and narrative construction are interwoven with performance metrics, team cohesion, and individual well-being. Athletes must navigate these forces simultaneously, balancing personal authenticity, professional responsibility, and the expectations of an invisible, emotionally invested audience. The toll is measurable, both in psychological terms and in the nuanced erosion of the private, sacred spaces of the locker room. As the cameras retract and seasons end, players confront the aftermath of constant observation. The emotional residue lingers in quiet locker rooms, in private conversations, and in moments of reflection. The identity constructed for public consumption may diverge from lived reality. Relationships may carry the strain of misrepresentation, and personal well-being may bear the imprint of sustained pressure. The experience of exposure is not ephemeral. It shapes careers, shapes perception, and shapes the human experience of being a professional athlete in a media-saturated environment. In the final analysis, the hidden cost of cameras in the locker room is a story of complexity, consequence, and resilience. Players endure pressures that extend far beyond the gridiron, navigating mental health, personal relationships, and professional integrity under scrutiny that is simultaneously public, mediated, and financially incentivized. The narrative of football as sport is inseparable from the narrative of football as entertainment, and the human cost is inseparable from the spectacle. Recognizing the hidden labor, the emotional weight, and the toll on identity is essential to understanding the full story of professional football in the modern media era. The next section will provide a reflective and analytical conclusion, synthesizing the cumulative impact of exposure, narrative construction, and economic incentive. It will examine the systemic consequences on players, teams, and the culture of professional football, offering a critical perspective on what it means to play under the glare of cameras, narrative imperatives, and fan expectations. As the cameras retreat and the season fades into memory, what remains is not the edited highlights or the narrative arcs designed for audience engagement. What remains are the men themselves, walking out of locker rooms forever altered by the invisible pressure of constant observation. Across the 20 segments of this journey, we have traced a transformation both subtle and profound. From the first camera that crossed the threshold of a previously sacred space to the parasocial bonds that made players perform not just for coaches and teammates, but for millions of unseen viewers. The story of reality television in the NFL is also the story of the human cost behind the spectacle. We began by examining the intrusion itself, the first moment when a player stepped into a locker room and realized that privacy no longer existed. The first camera disrupted tradition, ritual, and expectation. The locker room had always been a sanctuary where the private work of athletes, the camaraderie, and the friction of competition could exist without mediation. That sanctity was fractured, and with it came a subtle yet pervasive tension between authenticity and performance. Players found themselves acting in ways dictated not solely by strategy, skill, or personal preference, but by an awareness of external audiences whose attention was both involuntary and unavoidable. From there, we explored how narrative construction reshaped perception. Rising stars were cast as heroes, veterans as antagonists, and interpersonal conflicts were amplified for dramatic effect. Players became characters in a story they did not write, subjected to editing, selective sequencing, and framing that prioritized audience engagement over truth. Emotional labor, previously invisible, became a requirement of participation. The consequence was a psychological shift in which identity, performance, and self-perception merged under scrutiny. Anxiety, stress, and the weight of external judgment became recurring themes, echoing through locker rooms and affecting both young rookies and seasoned veterans. The role of production and coaching emerged as another critical dimension. Coaches faced dilemmas of leadership under observation, managing discipline and strategy while maintaining a performative presence. Producers shaped the narrative, subtly guiding interactions, highlighting drama, and controlling the story. Team-controlled content further blurred the line between documentation and manipulation, raising ethical questions about agency, consent, and the commodification of human experience. Players who attempted to resist narrative shaping often faced social, professional, and emotional consequences, illustrating the high cost of autonomy in a mediated environment. Family and personal life were also drawn into this orbit of exposure. Spouses, partners, and children became collateral participants in the narrative. The emotional strain of visibility extended beyond the individual athlete, affecting those who supported them. Relationships were reframed, privacy was compromised, and personal spaces became subject to public consumption. The human toll was real and cumulative, extending across seasons, teams, and careers. The narrative machinery of reality-style media transformed not just the experience of sport, but the lived reality of the people within it. Mental health emerged repeatedly as a central concern. Anxiety, depression, and stress were not merely side effects, but often direct consequences of constant evaluation and public scrutiny. Players struggled with dual identities, the athlete performing on the field and the persona constructed for the cameras. The labor of managing perception became nearly as taxing as the labor of competition. Rookies faced the shock of overnight exposure. Veterans navigated long-standing pressures amplified by media. And every player contended with the subtle, pervasive expectation to perform both physically and emotionally. The psychological consequences were often hidden, rarely visible in public. Yet their effects resonated through locker rooms, training facilities, and personal lives. The economic dimension cannot be ignored. Exposure is profitable. Storytelling drives revenue, engagement metrics, and fan investment. The commercial incentives for content production create systemic pressures that encourage emotional dramatization, personal exposure, and the commodification of athletes' private lives. Teams, leagues, and networks benefit from these dynamics while players bear the human cost. Decisions about strategy, interpersonal interaction, and personal conduct are influenced not only by competitive objectives, but by the imperatives of narrative and profit. This shift highlights a fundamental tension at the heart of modern professional football. The value of entertainment increasingly competes with the value of truth. Parasocial relationships amplify these pressures. Fans form intense emotional attachments to the curated versions of players, developing expectations that are often impossible to meet. Athletes are required to navigate public perception while maintaining performance, authenticity, and personal integrity. The psychological weight of parasocial bonds adds an additional layer of responsibility that is both invisible and unrelenting. Players report feelings of anxiety, self-consciousness, and emotional fatigue arising not from the game itself, but from the demands of external engagement. The result is a multifaceted form of pressure that permeates every aspect of professional life. As we examined individual case studies, from players resisting narrative framing to those consumed by the emotional consequences of exposure, a pattern emerged. Careers, identities, and relationships are all shaped by forces beyond the field. The cumulative effect of surveillance, editing, and audience expectation produces a unique professional reality. Success in modern professional football is no longer measured solely by physical skill, statistics, or victories. It is also influenced by adaptability to the pressures of exposure, emotional resilience, and the capacity to navigate complex social and psychological terrain. Players themselves have reflected on this intrusion in candid interviews. Some speak with regret, others with resolve, and many with a mixture of both. They recount the experience of walking into a locker room and feeling under constant observation of knowing that every word, gesture, and expression might be recorded, edited, and judged. They describe the exhaustion of managing personal authenticity while meeting the demands of performance and audience expectation. Their testimonies underscore a profound truth. The cost of reality-style media is not measured in dollars or ratings alone, but in the human experience of being observed, mediated, and narrated without full consent. The institutional response has been limited. Teams, leagues, and the Players' Union have made attempts to establish guidelines and offer mental health support, but systemic pressures remain largely intact. The economic incentive to produce engaging content ensures that visibility will continue. Regulatory structures are unable to fully mitigate the psychological impact, leaving players to navigate a complex terrain that is simultaneously professional, personal, and public. Questions about consent, autonomy, and ethical responsibility persist, with no clear resolution in sight. Ultimately, this exploration raises a fundamental question about the nature of professional sports in the modern media landscape. What happens when entertainment becomes more valuable than truth? When the spectacle of personal drama is prioritized over athletic performance, over privacy, over the human experience itself, the sport is transformed in ways that cannot be fully undone. The stakes of competition are no longer defined solely by athletic achievement, but are intertwined with narrative construction, audience perception, and commercial interest. The game is played not only on the field, but in the consciousness of viewers, editors, and producers, and the cost is borne by the players themselves. Reflecting on the entire journey, the narrative arc of the NFL under the influence of reality-style media reveals a complex interplay of power, psychology, and performance. Players are forced to negotiate identity, expectation, and emotion under unprecedented scrutiny. Teams navigate both competitive and narrative imperatives. Fans engage through parasocial bonds that amplify both admiration and judgment. The financial ecosystem rewards visibility and drama at the expense of privacy, authenticity, and sometimes well-being. Across every locker room, every season, and every production, the human consequences are quietly accumulated. The lasting lesson is one of awareness and empathy. To understand professional football today requires recognizing not only the physical and strategic demands of the sport, but also the emotional, psychological, and social labor that accompanies constant exposure. The players who entertain, inspire, and amaze audiences are navigating terrain far more complex than the game itself. They carry the weight of personal ambition, team responsibility, and external expectation, while simultaneously being observed and curated as characters in a story they did not author. Their resilience, their perseverance, and their humanity constitute a central, often unseen aspect of the sport. In closing, the integration of reality television into professional football is more than a matter of programming and production. It is a cultural shift that reshapes the locker room, transforms relationships, and imposes emotional and psychological burdens that are largely invisible to the audience. The men who inhabit this world are not only athletes, but also witnesses and participants in a profound experiment in mediated identity. Their experiences compel us to consider the broader implications of entertainment-driven exposure on human beings, professional culture, and the integrity of sport itself. As the last whistle blows and the cameras are packed away, the question remains: how does a sport maintain its essence when entertainment value eclipses truth? The answer is neither simple nor fully resolved. What is clear is that the men who play the teams that compete and the fans who watch all inhabit a new reality, one in which the collision of spectacle, commerce, and humanity leaves a mark that endures long after the season ends. The story of the NFL and its marriage with reality-style media is at once a tale of innovation, achievement, and human cost. It is a story of triumph and struggle, of exhilaration and exhaustion, of visibility and vulnerability. It is a story that will continue to unfold as long as the game is played under the glare of public attention. The echoes of this transformation will be felt in locker rooms, on practice fields, and in the private lives of players for generations to come. Understanding the interplay of exposure, identity, and narrative is essential not only for appreciating the modern game, but for recognizing the human beings at its center. Their stories, both visible and hidden, remind us that the cost of entertainment is often counted in quiet resilience, unspoken sacrifice, and the complex, sometimes painful, reality of life under observation. The final reflection is unflinching. Professional football is no longer only a sport. It is a mediated experience, a narrative experiment, and a human drama. The players are the protagonists, yet they do not always control the story. As audiences, institutions, and media entities continue to engage with this ecosystem, the challenge is to acknowledge, respect, and protect the humanity of the athletes who give everything they have on the field, in the locker room, and behind the scenes. The lessons of the past 20 batches illuminate the stakes and the cost of visibility. They demand reflection, ethical consideration, and empathy. This concludes the examination of how reality television reshaped professional football, altered the culture of the locker room, and changed the men inside it. The story is as much about human endurance, identity, and vulnerability as it is about the sport itself. It is a story that continues to unfold with every season, every broadcast, and every moment captured behind the cameras. The legacy of these changes is profound, permanent, and deserving of recognition, reflection, and understanding.